subscribe. Click on the bell. Like, comment.
Chapter 15 of Fairy Fingers by Cora Mowatt, Ritchie. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kelly Taylor. Chapter 15 The Embroidered Handkerchief. Maurice lost no time the next morning in seeking out the crafty old Jew. Enrique was a vendor of jewels that came into his hands through private sources. There was considerable risk in his traffic, for it was just possible some of the precious stones transferred to him might have been acquired in a manner not strictly legal. Perhaps it was not part of his policy to acquaint himself with the history of gems which he bought at bargain, and reaped an enormous profit in selling, for when Maurice endeavored to extract some information concerning the diamonds purchased by the Marquis de Fleury, the Jew protested entire ignorance in regard to their prior ownership, stating that they were brought to him by one of his confrères, of whom he asked no questions, that he had purchased them at a ruinous price, and resold them to the Marquis without a centime's benefit. A very generous proceeding on his part, he asserted, adding, with a ludicrous assumption of importance, that he highly esteemed the Marquis, and now and then allowed himself the gratification of favouring him in business transactions. "But the name of the person from whom your friend received the jewels is certainly on his books, and however numerous the hands through which they may have passed, they can be traced to the original owner," observed Maurice. "Not so easily, monsieur, not so easily. Purchaser has nothing to do with the original owner. Jewels worth something, or jewels worth nothing. That's the point. Names of parties holding the articles of no consequence." "But you certainly inquire what source the jewels offered you proceed." "Never make impertinent inquiries, never. Would drive away customers. If monsieur has any jewels for sale, shall be happy to look at them, disposed to deal in the most liberal manner with monsieur." "Thank you. My object is to simply discover a friend to whom the jewels you sold the Marquis de Fleury once belonged. It is indispensable that I learn through whose hands they came into your possession." "Ah," said the cunning Jew, placing his skinny finger on one side of his hooked nose, as if reflecting, then glancing at Maurice out of the corners of his searching eyes, he asked, "Party would like to be discovered, or would said party prefer to remain under the rose?" "Possibly the latter." "Just so. That gives interest to the enterprise. But when party objects to being traced, difficulties spring up. Takes time to overcome them, always a certain cost." "If you mean that I shall offer you compensation for your trouble, I am ready to make any in my power. Name your price." Price, not to be named so hastily. Depends upon time consumed. Labor obstacles party concerned may throw in the way. Other parties will have to be employed to seek out party who presented himself with the jewels. Requisite to induce communicativeness. May turn out party had the jewels from another party who obtained them from another. Shall have to track down each party's step backwards to the party who was the original possessor." "Take your own course. I am unskilled in these affairs," answered Maurice frankly. "All I ask is that you learn for me where the lady whose family jewels passed through your hands now resides. Name the cost of your undertaking." The wily Jew fastened his keen speculative eyes upon his anticipated prey as he replied slowly, "Cost? Can't say to a certainty. 1,000 francs to begin." He heard the faint sigh, of which Maurice himself was unconscious, and drew the correct inference. From the hour that the Vicomte had been made aware of the true state of Count Tristan's finances, he had reduced all his own expenses, allowed himself no luxuries, no indulgences, nothing but the barest necessities, that his father's narrow resources might not be drained through a son's lavishness. The young nobleman had not at the moment 100 francs at his own command. He had no alternative but to apply to Count Tristan for the sum required by the Jew. "My means are very limited," returned Maurice, with a great waste of candour. "I must beg you to deal with me as liberally as possible. The amount you demand I hope to bring you in a few days. In the meantime you will commence your inquiries." "Assuredly, just so. Commence putting matters in train at once. Possibly may have some clue between finger and thumb when monsieur returns with the money. Nothing to be done without golden keys. Unlock all doors, carry one into hidden depths of the earth. Shall be obliged to advance funds to pay parties employed. Have the goodness to write your name in this book." Maurice wrote down his name and address, and took his leave, once more elated by the belief that he was on the eve of discovering Madelaine's retreat. The letter to his father written and dispatched, he sought Bertha, and gave her full particulars of his interview with the Jew, delicately forbearing to mention the compensation he expected. Bertha, as sanguine of success as her cousin, was gaily discussing probabilities when the Marquis de Mirabel entered. "Young heads laid together to plot mischief, I wager," remarked the nobleman jocosely, for he was in a capital humour, having just partaken of an Epicurean déjeuner à la fourchette at the celebrated Madrid's. "We were talking about our cousin Madelaine. Maurice has a new plan for prosecuting his search," said Bertha. "Ah, dear Madelaine, why did she forsake us so strangely? How could she have had the heart to cause us so much sorrow?" "My dear child, it was probably her liver, not her heart, that was at fault. Her heart, I dare say, performed its grave duties properly, and should not be aspersed. Some bilious derangement was no doubt at the bottom of her singular conduct. The greatest eccentricities may all be traced to the bile as their origin. Regulate the bile, and you regulate the brain, from which mental vagaries proceed. If some judicious friend had administered to your cousin Madelaine a little salutary medicine, and forced her to diet a few days, she would have acted more reasonably. Talking of diet, that was a princely dinner the Marquis de Fleury set before us. He is really a very able and estimable member of society, understands good living to perfection. I cordially reciprocate his wish that a lasting bond of union should exist between us. His brother-in-law, the young Duc de Montauban, is enchanted with my little niece. I say nothing, arrange between yourselves, but all means marry into a family which knows how to value a good cook. Take a young man who has his taste sufficiently cultivated to distinguish of what ingredients a sauce is composed. Don't despise a blessing that may be enjoyed 365 times a year. That's my advice." Bertha had not attached any importance to the attentions of the young Duke, but her manner of receiving this suggestion, the half-disdain perched on the pouted blossom of her lips, convinced Maurice that, if she favoured any suitor, her inclinations did not turn towards the Duke. "The Duc de Montauban is not ill-looking," Maurice remarked, to decoy her into some more open expression, and he is sufficiently agreeable. Do you not think so?" "I never thought about him," she replied somewhat petulantly. "If I chance to look at him, I never think of any one but his tailor and his hairdresser, without whom I verily believe he would have no tangible existence." "An accomplished tailor and a skilful coiffeur are all very well in their way," observed her uncle, "but a scientific cook is the grand necessity of a man's life, a daily need, the trebly repeated need of each day. And the education of a cook should commence in the cradle. If this point receive the attention which it deserves from the sanitarians, there would be the fewer digestive organs out of order, and consequently fewer police reports, and a vast diminution of eccentric degradation, and moping madness and suicide, and horrors in general." Bertha and Maurice did not dispute this sweeping assertion, for they knew it would entail them upon the necessity of encountering a battalion of arguments, which the Marquis delighted to call into action to defend the ground upon which he took up his favourite position. Count Tristan's reply to Maurice, enclosed a cheque for the 1,000 francs, was received a few days later. Maurice returned to the Jew with the money. The latter rejoiced him by vaguely hinting that there was a prospect of a successful operation, but the matter would occupy time. The Vicomte would be good enough to call again in a week. Maurice was too unsuspicious and too unskilled in transaction of this nature to doubt that the Jew was dealing with him in good faith. Instead of the week, he returned the next morning, and repeated his visits regularly every day. The Jew diligently fanned his hopes, assuring him that old Henriquet was not to be baffled, though the parties through whose hands the jewels had passed were almost unapproachable. Very soon the merciless Israelite notified the young nobleman that further funds would be requisite, and Maurice writhed under the cruel compulsion which forced him to make a second application to his father. Bertha had been a fortnight in Paris when the anniversary of her birthday, which for the first time had been forgotten, was in a singular manner recalled to her mind. A small package had been received for her at her uncle's residence in Bordeaux, and had been promptly forwarded to Paris. The outer cover was directed in the handwriting of her uncle's concierge. On the inner, a request that if Mademoiselle de Merivale were absent, the parcel might be immediately forwarded to her, was written in familiar characters. Bertha had no sooner caught sight of them than she cried out, "Madelaine! It is the handwriting of Madelaine!" She tore open the paper with trembling hands. There was no note, not a single written word, but before her lay a handkerchief of the finest texture, and embroidered with the marvellous skill which belonged alone to those fairy fingers she had so often watched. Vainly we might attempt to convey even the faint idea of her tumultuous rapture, of the tears of ecstasy, the hysterical laughter, the dancing delight with which she greeted her uncle and Maurice, who entered a few moments after the package was received. She kissed the handkerchief, moistened with her tears, and waved it exultingly over her head, kissed it again, and wept over it again, while the Marquis and her cousin stood looking at her in speechless astonishment. "Madelaine! Madelaine! It is from Madelaine!" At last she found voice to ejaculate, "See, it is her writing," pointing at the paper cover, "and it is her work. Her fairy fingers send me a token on my birthday. I am 17 today, and no one has remembered it but Madelaine. She thinks of me still. She never forgets anyone. She has not forgotten me." Maurice caught up the paper in which the handkerchief had been enveloped, and, with throbbing pulses, eagerly examined the handwriting. "See, Maurice," Bertha continued joyfully. "In the corner she has embroidered my name, surrounded by a wreath of forget-me-nots. For she does not forget. The crest of the de Merveilles is in the opposite corner, and why, this looks like the bracelet I gave her on her last birthday. How wonderfully she has imitated the knot of pearls that fasten the golden band. And this corner, Maurice, look, this is in remembrance of you, of your birthday token to her. Do you not see the design is a brooch? The device a dove carrying an olive branch in its mouth, and the word Pax embroidered beneath." Maurice looked, struggling to repress the emotion that almost unmanned him. Pointing to the stamp upon the envelope which had contained the handkerchief, he said, "It is postmarked Dresden." "Dresden? Dresden? Can Madelaine be in Dresden?" returned Bertha. "Ah, uncle, can we not go there at once? We shall certainly find her. Yes, we must go. I am tired of Paris. Let us start tomorrow." "Dresden, my dear!" cried her uncle in a tone of unmitigated disgust. "Why, the barbarians would feed us upon sauerkraut and give us a pudding before meat. Go to Dresden? Impossible, not to be thought of. Paris was a wise move. We have been enjoying the living amazingly, but trust ourselves to those tasteless German cooks. We should be poisoned in a couple of days. Keep cool, my dear, or you will make yourself ill by getting into such a violent state of excitement just after breakfast. How do you suppose the most important process of digestion can progress favorably if your blood is agitated in this turbulent manner?" Bertha was about to answer almost wrathfully, but Maurice interrupted her. "I shall go, Bertha. Madelaine must be in Dresden. At last she has sent us a token of her existence, a token of remembrance. Thank heaven!" "Go, go, go at once!" was Bertha's energetic injunction. Maurice pressed her hand tightly, and, bowing to the Marquis, without attempting to utter another syllable, took his leave, carrying with him the envelope which bore Madelaine's handwriting. After having his passport visaed, he returned to his apartment to make rapid preparations for starting that evening. Very soon Gaston de Bois entered, evidently in a state of ill-concealed perturbation. "Mademoiselle Bertha tells me you are going to Dresden." "Yes, to seek my cousin. Look at the post-stamp upon this envelope. Madelaine is in Dresden." "How can you be sure of that?" asked Gaston. "She writes from Dresden. Can anything be clearer?" returned Maurice confidently. "It is not clear to me that she is there. I wish I could persuade you against taking this journey." "That is out of the question, Gaston, so spare yourself the trouble of the attempt." "But the journey will be useless," persisted Monsieur de Bois. "How can you know that?" inquired Maurice quickly. "I think so. It is my impression, my conviction." "It is not mine, and nothing can prevent me from making the experiment," answered Maurice decidedly. Gaston looked as thoroughly vexed as though he were responsible for the rash actions of his friend, but he knew that Maurice was inflexible where Madelaine was concerned, and that all entreaties would be thrown away unless he could sustain them by some potent reason, and that it was not in his power to proffer. He made no further opposition, but remained fidgeting about the room in the most distracting manner, hindering the preparations of Maurice, stumbling over articles scattered on the floor, now and then stammering out a broken, unintelligible phrase, and altogether seeming wretchedly uncomfortable, yet unwilling to leave until he saw the obstinate traveller in the fiacre which drove him to the railway station. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of Fairy Fingers by Anna Cora Mowatt Ritchie. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kelly Taylor. Chapter 16. A Voice from the Lost One. A few days after the departure of Maurice for Dresden, the Duc de Montauban made a formal proposal for the hand of Mademoiselle de Merivale, French etiquette not allowing a suitor the privilege of addressing the lady of his love except through some kindred or friendly medium. His pretensions were of course made known to Bertha by her uncle. She received the communication with a fretful tapping of her little foot, and a toss of her gambling golden ringlets, which bore witness to her undisguised vexation and saucy disdain. The uncompromising manner in which she declined the proposed honor threw her guardian, who had strengthened himself to enact the part of Cupid's messenger by a somewhat liberal repast, into a state of astonishment which threatened alarming disturbance to his laboring digestive functions. "Really, my dear, you speak so abruptly that you make me feel quite dyspeptic. What possible objection can you have to the young Duke?" "A very slight one, according to the creed which governs matrimonial alliances in our enlightened land," returned Bertha, pouting through her sarcasm. "My objection is simply he is not an object of the slightest interest to me." "But the match is such a suitable one that interest will come after it is consummated," answered her uncle. "I do not intend to marry upon faith," retorted Bertha. Then she broke off petulantly. "In a word, uncle, I do not intend to marry a man who is so insipid that I could not even quarrel with him, whom I could not think of seriously enough to take the trouble to dislike, to whom I am so thoroughly indifferent that for me he has no existence out of my immediate sight." There, keep cool, my dear. Nobody intends to force you to marry him. I did not know it was necessary to be able to dislike a man, and to have a capacity for quarrelling with him, to fit him for the position of husband. A very unwholesome doctrine. Emotion is particularly prejudicial to the animal economy. I thought the cultivated taste which the de Fleuries so evidently possess might have some weight with you. That dinner they gave us was unsurpassable, and if I am to marry to secure myself superlatively good dinners, I had better unite myself to an accomplished cook at once," replied Bertha demurely. "That's very tart, my dear. All acids disagree with me, and your acidulated observations are giving me unpleasant premonitory symptoms." Bertha noticed that the bon vivant had in reality begun to puff and pant as though he were suffering from an insipid nightmare. Being so thoroughly habituated to his idiosyncrasy that she had learned to regard it leniently, she made an effort to recover her good humor and answered, "I know my kind uncle will not render me uncomfortable by pressing this subject, but in the most courteous manner will let the Duc de Montauban understand that I do not intend to marry at present." "Make you uncomfortable," rejoined the Marquis, struggling for breath. "Of course I would not for the world. Do you take me for an old brute? And I have just made arrangements to drive you to the Bois de Boulogne and dine at Madrid's this evening. A pretty state you would be in to do justice to a dinner which promises to place in jeopardy the laurels even of Monsieur de Fleury's cook." "We will strike a bargain," returned Bertha, with her wonted gaiety. "If you will agree not to mention the Duc de Montauban, I will agree to do justice to the dinner at Madrid's." I am content. We will drop the Duke and discuss the dinner." The attentions of Madame de Fleury's brother to the heiress had been too marked and too open for his suit and its rejection to remain a secret. Gaston de Bois heard Bertha's refusal commented upon, and there was a buzz in his ears of idle speculations concerning the origin of her caprice. Was it some blissful internal suggestion which diffused such a glow of happiness over his expressive countenance when he next saw Bertha? Was it some hitherto uncertain ground of encouragement, made sure beneath his feet, which so wondrously loosened his tongue from its dire bondage? Was it some aerial hope, taking tangible shape, which imparted such an air of ease and elation to his demeanor? Gaston stammered less every day, his impediment disappearing as his self-possession increased. On this occasion he was only conscious of a slight difficulty in utterance to rejoice at its existence, for it rendered delightfully apparent Bertha's thoughtfulness in catching up words upon which he hesitated, and concluding sentences he commenced, as though she read their meaning in his eyes. Gaston had not seen her in so buoyant a mood since they parted at the Château de Gramont, but the tide of her exuberant gaiety suddenly ebbed when she noticed the look of pain with which he involuntarily responded to one of her chance questions. She had asked if he thought it was probable Maurice would find Madelaine in Dresden. Again that singular expression on his countenance, again that sudden change of colour at Madelaine's name, again that involuntary starting from his seat, with a return of the olden habit which placed fragile furniture in danger. Was it the remembrance that Madelaine was lost to them which occasioned M. de Bois' sudden depression? Was it an overwhelming sense of doubt concerning the result of Maurice's mission which made his response to Bertha's inquiry so vague, his sentences so disjointed? Once more Bertha asked herself whether he were not, after all, the lover Madelaine had refused to mention. Yet, if this were the case, how could Gaston have appeared so much less anxious and less concerned at her flight than Maurice, who loved her with unquestionable ardour? Why had M. de Bois aided so little in the search for her present habitation? The young girl could not reconcile such apparent contradictions, and while she sat perplexing herself by futile efforts to unravel these mysteries, M. de Bois was equally puzzled to rightly interpret her silence and abstraction. The interview which, at its opening, had been as bright as spring morning, closed with sudden April shadows, and there was an April mingling of smiles and tears upon Bertha's countenance when she retired to her chamber after M. de Bois' departure, and pondered over his strange expression when her cousin was mentioned. Why, if Madelaine was his choice, was his manner toward her so full of tenderness? Why was it that she never glanced at him without finding his eyes fastened upon her face? Why had he so much power to draw her irresistibly towards him? Why did his step set her heart throbbing so tumultuously? Why did his coming cause her such a thrill of delight, and his departure leave such sense of solitude? A void that no one else filled, a pain that no other presence soothed. Meantime, Maurice had reached Dresden, and was searching for Madelaine, almost in the same vague, unreasonable manner that he had sought her in Paris. But the mad course upon which he had started, and which might have once more unbalanced his mind, met with sudden check. The day after his arrival in Dresden, he received a note which ran thus: "Madelaine is not in Dresden. She entreats Maurice to discontinue a search which must prove fruitless. Should the day ever come, as she pray it may, when her place of refuge can become known to him, no effort of his will be required for its discovery. Will not Maurice accept the pains of the inevitable present and wait for the consolations the future may bring forth with the hope and patience which must sustain her until the blessed period shall arrive? Maurice was almost stupefied as he read these lines. He crushed the paper in his nervous fingers to be certain that it was tangible. He compared the writing with the one upon the envelope which he had taken from Bertha. If that were in Madelaine's hand, so was this. He looked for a postmark. There was none. The letter had been brought by a private messenger, and yet Madelaine was not in Dresden. How could this be? That in some mysterious manner she had become acquainted with his movements was unquestionable. Her thoughts then were turned to him. Her invisible presence followed him. It was some joy at least to know that he lived in her memory. Maurice, without a moment's hesitation, without letting his own personal suffering weigh in the balance of decision, without allowing his mind to dwell upon the probabilities of tracing Madelaine through this new clue, resolved to comply with her request. When he returned to Paris and placed her letter in Bertha's hands and told her his determination, she impetuously urged him not to be guided by their cousin's wishes. She pleaded that Madelaine was sacrificing herself from a mistaken sense of duty, that, if her place of abode could only be revealed, Bertha's own supplications might influence her to abandon her present project, and to accept the home which Bertha, with the full consent of her uncle, could offer. Maurice listened, not unmoved, but unshaken in his selected course. He felt that a woman of Madelaine's dignity of character, a woman of her calm judgment, a woman who could look with such steady, tearless eyes upon life's realities, a woman who would not have trodden in flowery ways, though every pressure of her foot crushed out some delicious aroma to perfume her life, if the stern lawgiver Duty summoned her to a flinty road and pointed to a glorious goal beyond. Such a woman, having deliberately chosen her path, having tested her strength to walk therein, having pronounced that strength all sufficient, deserved the tribute of confidence, and an even blind respect to her mandates. Besides, compliance with her wishes was a species of voiceless, wordless communication with her. It was sending her a message through some unknown and mysterious channel. Maurice presented this in its most vivid colors before Bertha's eyes, but in vain. She was too wayward, too unreasonable, too full of passionate yearning for the presence of Madelaine, too sensible of an innate weakness that longed to lean upon Madelaine's strength, to see the justice and wisdom of the conclusion to which Maurice had arrived. As soon as their painful interview was closed by the entrance of the Marquis, Maurice sought the old Jew, and ordered him to prosecute his search no further. Henriquet, who had already extracted a considerable sum from the young nobleman, and looked upon the transaction as a safe investment calculated to yield a certain profit for some months to come, was very unwilling to relinquish his promised gain. He assured the Vicomte that he had lately received information of the greatest importance. The party to whom the jewels had originally belonged had at last been tracked, and the undertaking was on the very eve of success. To abandon it was a refusal to grasp the prize almost within their clutch. Whether the cunning Jew spoke the truth or fiction mattered little, for Maurice, in spite of these alluring representations, did not allow himself to be tempted to violate Madelaine's express command. He had, as it were, accepted his fate, and cast away the arms with which men war with so-called destiny. Struggle and rebellion were over. To wait in patience was all that remained. But what was to be done with his existence? In the plenitude of youthful health and strength, was his life to ebb away, like an unreplenished stream flowing into nothingness? His days became more and more wearisome. The hours hung more and more heavily upon his hands. The feet of time sounded with iron tramp in his ears, yet never appeared to move onward. In his eyes a cloud and burthen lay. A shadowy sorrow dropped its pall of darkness over his mind and obscured his perception of all awakening, quickening inspirations. A smouldering fire within him withered up every vernal shoot of impulse, and turned all the springtime foliage of thought and fancy sere. His voice, his look, his mien betrayed that an ever-living woe encompassed him with gloom. Ronald fruitlessly strove to rouse him from this state of supine despondency. The active employment and all-engrossing interests which would have medicined his unslumbering sorrow were remedial agents denied by his father's unwise decree. As a substitute, though of less potency, Ronald strove to inspire him with his own strong love for literature. The young American had a passion for books, which were the reflex of great minds. His quick hearkening to the voices breathing from their pages, and made prophetic by some sudden experience, the ready plummet with which he sounded their depths of reasoning, the sentient hand with which he plucked out their truths and planted them in his own rich memory, to grow like trees filled with singing birds. These had rendered his comings with master spirits one of the noblest and most strengthening influences of his life. What wonder, when literature was so bounteously distributed over his native land, that made itself vocal beneath every hedge, enriched the humblest cottage with a library, found its way in the inexpensive guise of magazines, a welcome visitant at every fireside, poured out its treasures at the feet of rich and poor, liberally as liberal sunshine, freely as the free air. Maurice, educated in a different atmosphere at the same age as Ronald, was a stranger to the companionship of written minds, save those to which his college studies had formerly presented him, and his dark unrest rendered it difficult for him to follow his friend into the teeming Golconda of literature, and to gather the gems spread to his hands. And when, at last, Ronald's enthusiasm proved contagious and kindled Maurice to seek out some great author's charm, it too often chanced that he stumbled upon passages that irritated him and increased his moody discontent. We instance one of these occurrences as illustrative of many others. Ronald, whose busy brush had been brought to a standstill by an unusually dark day, when he returned to his apartment, found his friend reading Bulwer's Caxtons. Maurice was leaning with both elbows upon his table, his fingers plunged through his disordered hair, his brows almost fiercely contracted, and his wan face bent over the volume before him. "I found some grand pictures in that book," remarked the young artist. "Which are you contemplating?" "No pictures. I have not your eye for pictures," answered Maurice, with something more than a touch of impatience. "I am moved, haunted, tormented by truths which have never more power than all the ideal pictures pen ever drew or brush ever painted. You place me here before your library, lure me to read, and every book I open utters words that make my compulsory mode of existence a reproach, a disgrace, a misery to me. Read this, for instance. Life is a drama, not a monologue. A drama is derived from the Greek word which signifies to do. Every actor in the drama has something to do which helps on the progress of the whole. That is the object for which the author created him. Do your part, and let the great play go on. Do, continued Maurice in an exciting tone as he finished the quotation. It is a torment worthy of a place in Dante's Inferno to know that there is nothing one is permitted to do. I too am an actor in the great drama, but I have no part to play save that of a lay figure, motionless and voiceless, yet unhappy. Not being deprived of sensibility, I am goaded to desperation by inward taunting because I can do nothing. The play is not ended yet, answered Ronald, with as much cheerfulness as he could command, for his friend's depression affected his sympathetic nature. We may not comprehend our roles in the beginning. We may have to study long before we can thoroughly conceive, then idealize, then act them. I could bear that mine should be a sad if it were only an active one, returned Maurice, again fixing his eyes upon the book. Ronald could make no reply to a sentiment so thoroughly in accordance with his own views. He constantly pondered upon the possibilities through which his friend might be freed from the shackles that bound him to the effeminate serfdom of idleness, but the magic that could unrivet those fetters had not yet been revealed. Still, he was sometimes stirred by a mysterious prescience that they would be loosened, and through his instrumentality. Ronald's nature was essentially practical, without being prosaic. The rich ore of poetry, inseparable from all exquisitely fine organizations, lay beneath the daily currents of his life, like golden veins in the bed of a stream, shining through the crystal waters that bore the most commonplace objects on their tide. He thoroughly accepted that interpretation of the ideal which calls it a divine halo which the Creator has encircled the world of reality. But while he instinctively lifted all he loved into supernal regions and contemplated in the glorious spirit light that heightens all beauty, he lost sight of none of the stern actualities of their existence. His imagination had fashioned a hero out of Maurice, and he had thrown his person in heroic guise upon canvas, yet he clearly beheld and mourned over the morbid tendency that was weakening his mind and threatened to render his character and his life equally unheroic. Only a few days after this conversation we have just narrated, when Maurice entered Ronald's sitting room, he found the student with an open letter in his hand. As he lifted his eloquent brown eyes from the paper, a glistening moisture beaded their darkly fringed lashes, and an expression of ineffable tenderness looked out from their lustrous depth. The letter was from his mother, one of those messengers of deep affection which transported him into her presence, placed him, as he had so often sat in his petted boyhood, at her feet, to listen to her holy teachings, and to be thrilled to the very center of his being by her words of love. During his 3 years of separation, at a period when the expanding mind is the most impressionable, these letters, weekly received, had surrounded him with a heavenly aura which seemed breathed out through a mother's ceaseless prayers, and had kept his life pure, his spirit strong, his heart uplifted, and preserved him from being hurried by the wild, ungoverned impulses of youth, rendered more infectious by the volcanic fires of genius, into actions for which he might blush hereafter. It was one of the undefined, unspoken sources of sympathy between Ronald and Maurice, that the guarding hand of woman, influencing them from a distance, preserved the bloom, the freshness, the pristine purity of both their souls, even in the polluted atmosphere of a city where immorality is an accepted evil. Maurice, who had never known a mother's hallowing affection, gained his strength through his early attachment to a maiden whom no man could love without being ennobled thereby, and Ronald, whose heart had never yet awakened to the first pulse of tenderness which drew him toward one he would have claimed as a bride, owed his powers of resistance to a strong as passionate devotion to a mother who united in her person all the most glorious attributes of womanhood, and whose idolizing love for her child was tempered by wisdom which placed his spiritual progress above all other gain. While he was struggling to win laurels in art's arena, she strove to bind upon his brow a crown whose gems were heavenly truths, a crown the pure in spirit alone could wear. Blessed the son who has such a mother, safe and blessed. His foot shall tread upon the serpent that lies beneath the tempting flowers in his path, ere the reptile can sting him. His hand shall resolutely put away the cup of pleasure from his lips when there is poison in the chalice. He shall walk through the fire of evil lust unscathed. No laurel that wreathes his brow shall render it too feverish or too proud to lie upon that mother's bosom with the glad, all-confiding, satisfied sense which made its joy when it lay there in guileless boyhood. That mother's love shall smooth for him the rough ways of the earth, and place in his hand the golden key that opens heaven. As Maurice took his seat beside Ronald, the latter, hastily sweeping his handkerchief across his eyes, said in a vehement intonation, "I have come to a sudden determination. I am going back to America. The trip is nothing, 10 days over and 10 back, a mere trifle. I can spend a couple of months with my parents and be back in time for autumn work. Instead of sending my picture, which is nearly completed, I will present it in person." Maurice sighed as he answered, "They will be proud of your work. Happy are they who have work to do, and who do it faithfully." "That is a sentiment worthy of an American," rejoined Ronald. "Indeed, you have unconsciously stolen it from one of our most distinguished American writers, who says, 'To have something to do, and to do it, is the best appointment for us all.' The extent to which I have insensibly Americanized you is very evident. A thought has just struck me. You are weary and melancholy, and seem to grow much paler and thinner every day. It will revive and strengthen you to accompany me. Come, let us go together." "Let us fly to the moon," answered Maurice, half scornfully. "Ronald, why do you always forget that although we have lived precisely the same number of years, and I may be said to have lived so much longer than you, if we count the time by sorrows that make long the days, though we have both passed our 21st anniversary, you, as an American, have obtained your majority and are a free agent, while the law of France renders me still a minor for 4 years. You know I cannot stir without my father's consent, and of course that is unobtainable." "Unobtainable if you choose to imagine that it is, and will not seek for it," answered Ronald rebukingly. "The wisest poet that ever penned his inspiration says, 'Our doubts are traitors, and make us lose the good we oft might win, by fearing to attempt.' Do not let your traitorous doubts frighten you from the trial." Maurice smiled away his rising irritability and said, "I think, Ronald, your mind is so full of poetic arrows that one could not take a step or lift a finger or draw a breath without your being able to hit him with a verse." "A verse may hit him who a sermon flies," retorted Ronald laughingly. "A man is easy to hit who sits down with folded hands, like him of whom my rhythmic shaft just made a target. But to speak seriously, do you wonder that true thoughts, beautiful thoughts, which have been thrown into the music of verse, keep their haunting echoes in some stronghold of memory and surge up to the lips when a stirring incident causes the gates of the mind to vibrate? While the very proof of the poet's genuine inspiration, his chiefest triumphs, lies in this, that he speaks a familiar truth, a common word of hope, a little word of comfort, a simple word of warning, with such a potency that it strikes deeper into the soul than any other adjuration can reach. It defies us to forget. It takes the sound of prophecy and thrills our hearts and governs our actions in spite of ourselves. So much in the defense of my poetic memories. Now be generous enough to admit that poetry is usually mingled with a large portion of prosaic common sense, which resolves itself into action. My scoffed-at poetry interprets itself into this matter-of-fact prose. Unless you have the courage, the energy, to ask your father's consent to accompany me to America, you will not get it. If you ask, you may get it. And if you accompany me, it may profit you. Come, what say you? I shall be ready to start this week." "So soon?" ejaculated Maurice, who, often as he had witnessed the promptitude with which the young American moved, could not yet familiarize himself with his national rapidity of action and decision. "You call it soon? Why, if I had said the day after tomorrow, it might have been termed soon, but it seems to me a week is time enough to prepare for the journey around the world. Come, if you have a half an hour before the post closes, dash off your letter and let it go at once." As he spoke, he cleared his writing table of books and papers by which it was encumbered, and placed a chair for Maurice. The latter, who was always carried onward by the rushing current of his friend's strong will, wrote, on the spur of the moment, a letter more calculated to impress his father than any deliberately studied epistle. The restless and gloomy state of mind under which Maurice labored revealed itself in this impulsive effusion with a force which might not have found its way into a calmer communication. The frequent applications for money which Maurice had been compelled to make, that he might meet the demands of the old Jew, were not without their influence in preparing Count Tristan to look favorably upon his son's solicitation. The Count imagined that sums so constantly demanded were squandered in a manner habitual to gay young men in Paris. He had experienced much difficulty in complying with his son's last request, and became painfully aware that it would not much longer be in his power to supply him at the same extravagant rate. As a natural consequence, he hailed the proposition to travel, which might break off any unfortunate connections or liaisons as he might have formed in Paris, and without their aid divert his troubled mind. Then the present would be a favorable opportunity for Maurice to visit his estate in Maryland, and to learn something further of that railway company which seemed of late to have suspended its operations. Maurice was not less astounded than overjoyed upon receiving his father's prompt and unconditional consent to his proposed trip. He at once carried the letter to Bertha. She was too generous to oppose a step which promised to be advantageous to her cousin, yet she could not contemplate their inevitable separation without sincere sorrow. "I wish I was going with you," she sighed. "It seems to me everybody is going to America. Have you not heard that Marquis de Fleury has just received an appointment of ambassador to the United States? I wish my uncle would let me travel to some foreign country. I am weary of this Parisian ball-going life." "Has Monsieur de Fleury received his appointment at last? I had not heard of it. Who told you?" inquired Maurice. "Monsieur de Bois, this very morning." "Gaston goes with him, I presume?" "Yes, he said so." "That is expected pleasure. That is really delightful," exclaimed Maurice enthusiastically. Bertha did not reply, but she certainly looked inclined to pout, as though she had no distinct perception of delight in the question. In a few days Maurice and Ronald were on the great ocean. A fortnight later, the Marquis and Marchioness de Fleury and the secretary of the former, Monsieur de Bois, were also on their way to the New World. Bertha worried her uncle by her sad face, listless manner, and low spirits, to say nothing of her loss of appetite. to his thinking the most important feature of her malaise, until he was convinced that she had lost all interest in Paris, and that her sadness would be increased by a longer sojourn in the gay capital. When she admitted this, he kindly inquired if she desired to travel. "Yes, very much," was her reply. Whither would she like to go? To Italy? To England? To Russia? "No, to America." America? Land of savages, land of Pawnees and Choctaws, land where the cooking must be in its crude infancy. Her uncle could not listen to such a barbarous proposition, and, finding that he could obtain no other answer from his wilful and incomprehensible ward, he carried her back to Bordeaux, consoling himself with the reflection that although the visit to Paris had not been permanently advantageous to his niece, the culinary knowledge acquired by Lucienne was a full compensation. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of Fairy Fingers, a novel by Cora Mowatt Ritchie. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kelly Taylor. Chapter 17, Chiffons. Chiffons. Talking chiffons, writing chiffons. Will anyone have the goodness to furnish us with a literal yet lucid interpretation of this enigmatical form of speech so incessantly employed in the Parisian beau monde? Among the translatable words of the French language, among the expressive terms which cannot be rendered by equally significant expressions in our own more copious tongue, among the phraseology invented to convey ideas which the phrases themselves certainly do not suggest, the common application of this curt little word, chiffons, holds a distinguished place. Look for chiffons in the dictionary, and you will see it simply defined as rags. Yet chiffons represent the very opposite of rags feminine, and conjure up multitudinous array of feminine fashions, fripperies, fancies, follies, indispensable aids and adjuncts of the feminine toilette. We have headed this chapter Chiffons, and given an imperfect definition of the term as a signpost of warning to masculine readers, a hint that this chapter is to be lightly skimmed, or altogether skipped, for it unavoidably treats of chiffons, which the necessities of the narrative will not allow us to suppress. The Marquis de Fleury had been appointed ambassador from the court of Napoleon III to the United States of America. Madame de Fleury's state of mind, in spite of the consolation afforded by a number of strikingly original costumes, which she innocently flattered herself would prove very effective during the sea voyage, was deplorable. Terror inspired by the perils of the deep was only surpassed by intense grief excited by her compulsory banishment to a land where, she imagined, the invading feet of modiste and mantua-maker had not trodden out of all resemblance to the original Eden, a land where women probably attired themselves with a leaning to antediluvian simplicity, or in accordance with strong-minded proclivities, and the men were, doubtless, too much engrossed by politics and business to be capable of appreciating the most elaborate toilette that could be fashioned to captivate their eyes, a land, in short, where taste was yet unborn, and where it was ignorantly believed that the chief object of apparel was to perform on a more extensive scale the use of primitive fig leaves and furs. To prevent her from falling into the clutches of American barbarians, Madame de Fleury secured 2 French maids as a bodyguard. Into the hands of one, skilled in the intricate mysteries of hairdressing, her head was unreservedly consigned. The other, versed in the more varied arts, had entire charge of the rest of her person. But these aides-de-camp of toilette were deemed insufficient for the guardianship of her charms. The moment her sentence of exile was pronounced, she had summoned the incomparable Vignon to her presence, and piteously painted the difficulties which must have beset her path when she was remorselessly torn from the reach of the creative fingers of the artist couturier. Vignon had unanticipated comfort in store, the most accomplished of her assistants, one who had exhibited a skill in design and execution positively marvelous, had several times expressed a strong inclination to establish herself in America, and would gladly make her debut in the New World under the patronage of the Marchioness. This information threw Madame de Fleury into such ecstasies that all the waves of the Atlantic, which had been ruthlessly tossing their wrecks about her brain, were suddenly stilled, and she declared that Mademoiselle Melanie must make her preparations to sail in the same steamer, for the knowledge that she was on board would render the voyage endurable. The Marchioness complacently added that she felt so much strengthened by these tidings that she could now look forward to meeting, with becoming fortitude, the trials incident upon her residence among a semi-civilized nation. We need hardly relate how soon, after reaching Washington, the fair Parisian discovered that civilization had made astounding progress, if it might be estimated by the deference paid to Chiffons. Nor need we portray her astonishment at finding that American women of fashion were not merely close copyists of extreme French modes, but they exaggerated even the most extravagant, and hunted after the newest styles with the national energy which their countrywomen of a nobler class expended on nobler objects, and were more ready to deform or ignore nature, and swear allegiance to the despotic rule of the crinoline sovereign than any Parisian belle under the sun. Madame de Fleury's royal sway over the empire of Chiffons was soon as thoroughly established in Washington as it ever had been in Paris. Dress or headdress, bodice, bonnet, mantle, gaiter, glove worn by her multiplied itself in an important imitations, and every feminine chrysalis set forth its ballroom butterfly in a livery to match. Whatever style, shape, color she adopted, however extraordinary, became the rage for that season, and disappeared from sight, totally banished by her regal command at the inauguration of the next. At one period no skirt could sweep the pavement or lie in rich folds at the bottom of a carriage, unadorned by an imposing flounce that almost covered the robe. A little later, the one sober flounce was driven into obscurity by 20 coquettish small ones, and these were displaced by primly puffed bands, which gave way to fanciful keys running up the sides of the dress, where they seemed to have no possible right, and those vanished when double skirts commenced their brief reign, to be dethroned by a severe-looking quilted ruffle marching around the hem of the dress and up the center to the throat, and this grave ornament suddenly found its place usurped by an inundation of fantastic trimmings, jet bugles, passementerie, velvet, or lace. So much for skirts. Then the bodices. Now nothing was to be seen but the square cut, which revealed the fine bust of beauties in the days of Charles II. Now graceful foals à cour sentimentally ruled the day. Now infant waist became a passion. And now the most maternal forms aped juvenility borrowed from their babies. Then for sleeves. At one time they were wide and long and cumbrous, forbidding every trace of the most rounded member beneath. Then they took the form of antique drapery, disclosing the arm, almost nude, save for the transparent lace of the undersleeve. Then the close, tight fit of the Quaker left all but the distorted outline to the imagination. And bonnets, at one moment the tiniest bird's nest of a hat, embowered in feathers and buried in lace, was perched on the back of the head, reminding one of Punch's suggestion that it could be more conveniently carried on a slather by a domestic walking behind. A little later, the only bonnet admissible closed around the face like a cap. Laces and feathers had disappeared. A few tastefully disposed knots of ribbon or a single flower were the only ornaments. But Hardly had good sense nodded approvingly at the graceful simplicity with which heads were covered, when lo, the bonnets shot up like bright-hued coal shuttles, over which a basket of buds and blossoms had suddenly upset, and went through a variety of fantastic transformations wholly indescribable. So with other articles of attire. Mantles that had established for themselves a natural and convenient length suddenly grew down to the hem of the dress. Basques, high in favor, were routed by zouave jackets. Girdles were at the moment drawn down with tight pressure until they barely surmounted the hips. The next were allowed to take an almost natural round, as far as their fitting locality went, and next were put wholly to flight by pointed Swiss belts, with enormous bows and long flowing ends, while these, in turn, were chased from the field by picturesque scarfs. Then, as regards the disposition of that native veil of unsurpassable beauty which adorns the head of women, now all locks were braided low at the back of the head, almost lying upon the neck. Now they were surmounted at the crown, and rose in stories higher and higher. Now they sprang into a pair of wings from either side of the temple. Now they clustered in a tuft of disorderly curl above the brow, now smoothed and bandolined close to the face, and nodded with an air of quiet simplicity behind the ears. Whichever of these modes the Parisian queen of the chiffons rendered graceful in her own person, every fair one, with the slightest aspiration to style, strengthened her claims to be thought fashionable by scrupulously assuming. What wonder that Mademoiselle Melanie, prime minister to the absolute sovereign, could scarcely receive the crowd of clients that thronged to her doors. She hired a spacious mansion near the capital and furnished it with consummate taste. She combined the vocation of mantua-maker with that of milliner, and supplied all the materials she employed from an assortment of her own selection. This was one secret of her astonishing success, for it gave her control over the entire apparel of her customers, regarding herself as responsible for the tout ensemble of each toilette that issued from her hands, and her reputation as at stake if any defective touch marred the general result of her adorning. She exerted a thoroughly despotic sway over those whom she undertook to dress, and refused, in the most positive yet courteous manner, to allow them to follow the dictates of their own faulty fancies. As a skilful artist examines a picture in the best light, that all its beauties may be revealed, she placed each one of her subjects in the most favorable aspect, studied them closely, searched out every fine point which might be heightened, and pondered over every defect which might be concealed. She had a rare gift of knowing how to embellish nature, how to bring forth all capacities of face and form, and how to modify the fashion of the day to the requirements of the wearer, instead of slavishly following an arbitrary mode, and thereby sacrificing all individuality of beauty. Dress became high art in her hands. Wondrously harmonious were the effects produced. Blondes looked softer and purer than ever before, without becoming insipid. Brunettes grew more piquant and brilliant. Nondescripts gained force and character. Pallid faces caught a reflection of rose tints. Too ruddy complexions were toned down by paling colors, and sallow skins found their ochre hue mysteriously neutralized. Angular shapes were draped so gracefully that their unsymmetrical sharpness disappeared. Too ample forms exchanged their air of uncouth corpulence for a well-defined roundness. Low statures seemed to spring up to nobler altitude. Women of masculine height sunk into feminine proportions. In short, Mademoiselle Melanie was not a mantua-maker or a milliner. She was a genius of taste, the artful embodier of poetry in outward adorning. Her own person was strikingly attractive, but the severest simplicity characterized her attire. Her manners, though affable, were exceedingly reserved. Without any apparent effort, she repressed the familiarity of the vulgar and rebuked the patronizing airs of the assuming, winning instinctive deference even from the ill-bred. By her workwomen she was almost worshipped. Young herself, she impressed them with the sense that notwithstanding her lack of advantage over them in the point of years, her superior skill and knowledge entitled her to be their head. She sympathized with their griefs, inquired into their needs, sometimes ignored their shortcomings, but never their sufferings, and took care that the thread which helped fashion a lady's robe should not be drawn with such a weary and overworked hands that, in the language of Hood, it sewed a shroud at the same moment. She was seldom seen in the streets, and when her duties called her, she went forth closely veiled. But her distinguished air, the simple elegance of her apparel, and the dignified grace of her movements could not escape admiration. She soon found a carriage of her own indispensable, and selected an unostentatious equipage, but allowed herself the indulgence of a pair of superb horses, because she chanced to be an appreciating judge of those noble animals, a rather unusual knowledge for a courtier. She seldom walked or drove alone. She was usually accompanied by one of her assistants, a young Massachusetts girl, with whom she had been thrown into an accidental communication shortly after her arrival in the United States. The history of Ruth Thornton is one every day repeated, but not less touching because so far from rare. Born and bred in affluence which emanated from the daily exertions of her father, his death left his widow and 3 orphan daughters destitute. The eldest early assumed the burdens of wifehood and maternity. Ruth was the second child. A girl of high spirit, she quickly laid aside all false pride and earnestly sought to earn the bread of those she loved by the labor of her fair young hands, until then strangers to toil. But where was remunerative occupation to be found? Needy womanhood so closely crowded the few open avenues of industry that it seemed as though there was no room for another foot to gain a hold, another hand to struggle. To become a teacher or governess was Ruth's first, most natural endeavor, but month after month she sought in vain for a situation. She possessed a remarkable voice and a decided musical talent. The idea of the concert room suggested itself, but her naturally fine organ lacked the long cultivation that could alone fit it to embark upon a career of a singer. Her mind turned to the stage, but, setting aside the difficulty of obtaining engagements, Even to fill some position in the lowest ranks of the profession, she had no means, no time to go through the long course of requisite study, or to procure herself the costly wardrobe indispensable to such a profession. She pondered upon the possibility of entering that most noble institution, the New York School of Design for Women. Here was meat work, hope-fanning, life-saving work for feminine hands, engraving on wood or steel, coloring plates for illustrated works, sketching designs for fashion to be used in magazines, or patterns for carpets, calicoes, paper hangings, etc. But on inquiry, she learned that a year's study would be needful before she could hope to gain a modest livelihood through the medium of the simplest of these pursuits. From whence, in the meantime, could her mother or sister and herself derive their support? Next, she resolved to resort to her needle, yet how small was the likelihood of keeping it employed, and how poor the pittance it could earn as a humble seamstress. True, she might learn a trade, but how was she to exist meantime? She stood erect in the midst of this desert of difficulties, perplexed but undismayed, and still believing in, and steadfastly seeking for, the work allotted to such weak hands as hers. There is something magnetic in unflagging energy and untiring hope. They mysteriously attract themselves to the materials which they most need. By a seeming accident, Ruth heard that an assistant housekeeper was required at the Fifth Avenue Hotel in New York. Her high-born relatives learned with horror that one of their kin, the daughter of a gentleman who had held an honorable position in their community, contemplated fulfilling this menial position. But, in spite of their disapproval, Ruth presented herself as an applicant for the post, and, though her youth, for she was hardly 20, was an objection, her services were accepted, and she entered forthwith upon lowly duties. We need not dwell upon the manifold and humiliating trials to which she was subjected, trials to which the loveliness of her person largely contributed. Like a true American maiden, well-disciplined, self-reliant, and of strong principles, she found protection within herself, and bade defiance to dangers which might have proved fatal to one whose early training had been less productive of strength. It was while Ruth was meekly discharging these humble duties that she became acquainted with Mademoiselle Melanie. On arriving in New York, Madame de Fleury had taken up her residence for a few days in the Fifth Avenue Hotel, and, as though she feared to lose sight of Mademoiselle Melanie, requested her to do the same. A severe indisposition, which caused the latter to seek feminine aid, threw her in communication with the housekeeper of the hotel and her young assistant. Mademoiselle Melanie quickly became interested in the sweet, pale, patient face hovering about her bed, and did not fail to note the air of refinement which seemed at variance with her position. In less than 24 hours, the young French couturier had learned the history of the young American housekeeper, and resolved, if she prospered in America, to remove this lovely girl from her present perilous position to one less exposed. 6 months later, Ruth received a letter from Washington, making her an offer to become one of the assistants of Mademoiselle Melanie, and gratefully accepted the proposal. Mademoiselle Melanie found her young employee's health too delicate for an exhausting apprenticeship to the needle, and employed Ruth in copying and coloring sketches of costumes which the accomplished couturier herself designed. As she became more and more conversant with the noble character of her protégée, the spontaneous attachment she had conceived for her grew stronger, and Ruth Thornton became her constant companion. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of Fairy Fingers by Cora Mowatt Ritchie. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kelly Taylor. Chapter 18. Maurice. On their arrival in America, Ronald took Maurice to his southern home, where he was received with a cordial hospitality that strengthened and confirmed the tie of brotherhood between the young men. We will not attempt to portray the meeting between Ronald and his parents, a meeting so full of joy that its throbs quickened into the pulse of pain, as though clay-compassed hearts were hardly large enough to endure the ecstasy of such a reunion, nor will we dwell upon the proud elation with which Ronald's first ambitious attempt in art was contemplated by his parents. Their praises might simply have testified that love appreciates. The hand that wrought might have sanctified even a feeble work to their sight. But colder judgments pronounce Ronald's initiatory achievements a pledge of power, and all the more decisive because the execution of the youthful hand obviously had not kept pace with the strong conception of the fervid brain. We pass on to the effect produced upon Maurice by his sojourn in Ronald's transatlantic home. Many a pang did the young Frenchman endure as he noted the thorough and genial understanding which seemed to exist between the southern youth and his father. Maurice was amazed by Mr. Walton's unfailing recognition that his son was a responsible being, by the confidence he reposed in him, by the unequivocal manner in which he placed him upon a footing of equality, even while guiding him by his counsels offered as the results of a larger experience, yet never so compulsory urged as to check his son's freedom of decision. Maurice marked, too, the earnest interest with which Mr. Walton entered into all Ronald's project, albeit some of them appeared too wild and high-reaching to be easy of accomplishment, beheld how readily the paternal hand was stretched out to soften the ordeals through which the neophyte must inevitably pass, and was moved by the touching frankness with which the noble-minded parent repeatedly congratulated himself that he had not permitted his own predilections to force Ronald into a field of action repugnant to his tastes. When Maurice instinctively compared this liberal, high-toned father's mode of influencing his son with the tyrannous control of the haughty count, and contrasted Ronald's untrammeled position with his own state of dependent nonentity, he felt that unstruggling submission to the cruel decree which doomed him to waste those fresh, strong, aspiring years of his life in hopeless idleness was a weakness rather than a virtue. He was only spared from passing a judgment upon his father more correct than filial by throwing the blame of his conduct upon the shackling customs and false opinions and arbitrary laws of his native land. He could not but be forcibly struck by the wide dissimilarity between the usages and views of life which distinguish the two nations. In America, he saw men, self-made and self-educated, at an age when young Frenchmen have scarcely begun to be aware that they have any independent existence, rising to prominent and honorable positions, taking a bold part in public affairs, and asserting by their achievements the maturity of their brains. He saw men who have been forced by circumstances to commence their lives of toil and self-important at 15 and 18, a few years later not only gaining their own livelihood, but contributing to the maintenance of their families, and laying the foundation of future fortune. He saw artistic taste, literary talents, professional, legislative, and military abilities brought to opulent fruition in men but a few years his senior. And though everyone seemed to work at high pressure, everyone appeared to live rapidly, crowding each day with actions. Still men lived consciously, planting along the pathway of their pilgrimage the landmarks of positive deeds. And they sowed and reaped and rejoiced in their harvest. And if some of them grew old faster than their European brethren, their age was at least enriched by varied memories, vast experiences, manifold mental gains that testified to the value of their lives. And was it imperative, Maurice asked himself, that the accident of noble blood should paralyze a man's volition, and that the bearing of a noble name should render his life inertly ignoble? He recognized that, in the seeming curse which condemned a man to work, God had hidden the richest blessing, even as he buried golden veins in the dark bosom of the earth. Labor was privilege, and gave its sweetest flavor to the daily cup of life. As for Ronald, though he loved his country with the enthusiasm which characterized all his affections, he had never been fully cognizant of the advantages it possessed over the land in which he had lately sojourned until he saw them through the eyes of Maurice. Nothing is more true than that we can render no services to another by which we are not served ourselves. Served spiritually, therefore actually, and in the highest sense, and not merely in his new appreciation of the land of his birth, but in numerous other ways. Ronald was the unconscious gainer by the helpful influence he exerted over his friend. The youthful mentor confirmed himself in grand and vital truths while imparting them to Maurice. His own noble resolves were quickened into activity while he sought to infuse them into the mind of another. His own spirit acquired strength while he was endeavoring to render his companion strong of soul. Ronald's character was perhaps more affluent and expansive, had more force and fixedness of purpose than that of Maurice, yet it derived fresh vigor from the less hopeful, less confident nature upon which it acted. Though Maurice owed much to the young art student, he soon owed more to that gentle but potent hand by which Ronald had been molded, refined, and spiritualized. Ronald's mother opened wide her large heart and her loving arms to take in the motherless youth thrown by an apparent accident within her sphere. Mrs. Walton was one of those beings to whom life is a poem. Read it in sorrow or gladness, read it whatever way you will, because all things to her mind had a divine significance. She knew that nothing had either its end or origin here, and felt that the very daydreams and aspirations of impulsive youth descended by influx from those supernal regions in which all causes exist, though we darkly behold them through effects ultimated upon our earthly plane. Her eyes were never bent upon the ground to search out stumbling blocks of doubt, but looked up Godward until the heavens grew less distant, and earth's perplexing mysteries were solved, and daily joys and daily pains only acquired importance through their bearing upon the joys and pains of eternity, and celestial light, flowing through her pure thoughts, reflected its mellow glory upon her humblest surroundings, and tinged them with ineffable beauty. Maurice, who had been so deeply impressed by Ronald's attributes and aims, quickly recognized the fountainhead from whence flowed the living waters he drank, and, humbly bending to quaff at the same spring, became conscious that his whole being was vitalized and renewed. The great ends of existence, for the first time, became apparent to him, and as he learned to look upon the present and temporal as only of moment through their effect upon the future and eternal, as he renounced a senseless belief in the very names of chance and accident, and yielded to the conviction that the simplest as the gravest occurrence all tend to lay some stone in the great architectural edifice which every man is building for his own dwelling place in the hereafter, his trials, by some wondrous transmutation, wore a holy aspect, and gently into his unfolding spirit stole the comforting assurance that those very trials might be the fittest, the strongest, the appointed instruments to hew out the pathway he panted to tread, and carve for him a future which could never have been wrought by such tools as the velvety hands of prosperity hold in their feeble grasp. The morbid melancholy into which Maurice had fallen, and which deepened with his vain pondering over the mysterious fate of Madelaine, rolled from his spirit before the breath of hope. Hope breathed through sunshine from the lips of a woman whose sympathetic voice, tender looks, and quick comprehension of his emotions insensibly melted away reserve and drew out all of his confidence. He could talk to Mrs. Walton of Madelaine with an absence of reticence, an unchecked gush of feeling, which would not have been possible when he conversed with Ronald, or with anyone but a woman, and such a woman. Far from advising him, as a worldly wise counselor would have done, to struggle against a passion which did not promise to prove fortunate, she bade him cherish the image of one he so ardently loved with perfect trust, that if that woman were indeed his other self, that separate half which makes a man's full complement, he would, in spite of all adverse circumstances, be drawn to her by mysterious and invisible cords until their union was consummated. Mrs. Walton entertained the not irrational belief that, as either sex alone is half itself, and each fulfills defects in each, there was created for every male soul some female spirit, whose heart was capable of responding to the finest pulses of his, one who could meet his largest requirements, one who could alone render his being perfect, his true manhood complete, one whom he might never meet on earth, and yet who lived for him. This great truth, for as such he accepted it, was a glorious revelation to Maurice. He cast out the remembrance that Madelaine had said she loved another, or only recalled her declaration to feel certain that she had mistaken her own heart, or that he had misconstrued the language she had used. She became more vividly present than ever to his mind, and the constant thought that now confidently and happily wound itself about her seemed to him to annihilate material distances and bring their spirits into close communion. Maurice passed 2 delightful months beneath the hospitable roof of Mr. and Mrs. Walton. The period which Ronald had allowed himself for a holiday drew to close. The sense of unoccupied power had begun to render him restless, and it was with elation which might have appeared tinctured with ingratitude by those who did not comprehend the mysterious workings of his untranquil ambition that he prepared for his return to that foreign land where he could enjoy advantages for the prosecution of his art studies unobtainable in a young country. When Maurice embarked for America with Ronald, it was understood that they were to return to Europe together. But one morning, when the latter casually announced his intention of securing their passage on board a steamer about to sail from New York, Maurice turned to him and said abruptly, "Ronald, 1 berth will be sufficient." "My dear fellow, what do you mean?" inquired Ronald, only half surprised. "It is impossible for me," replied Maurice, "to return to my life of indolence and supposed gaiety. A snake might more easily crawl back into his cast-off skin. I have breathed this free, exhilarating, vitalizing atmosphere, and the convention-laden atmosphere of Paris would stifle me. I have written to my father and announced that I propose to remain in Charleston. That is not all. He forbade my studying law in Paris because his sapient Breton neighbors would have been scandalized by a vicomte's taking so sensible a step. But possibly I may prepare myself for the bar at this distance without subjecting my father to the annoyance of their disapproval. The period required for study is shorter, and I shall have a wider field in which to practice. I cannot be prepared to enter upon the duties of my profession much before the time when, according to the laws of France, I shall reach my majority. Meanwhile, I study, we will say, for amusement. I study as other men hunt, fish, boat, skate. What do you think of my plan?" Ronald grasped him warmly by the hand. "It is just what I expected of you, Maurice. When we first met, I was so strongly attracted to you. An internal prescience whispered that you had within you the very qualities which are asserting their existence today." "They might have been in me, Ronald," answered Maurice with emotion, "but I fear they would never have been brought out but for your agency. I can never be grateful enough that we have been thrown together. I can never sum up the good you have done me. I stood in such great need of just the influence you and your mother." The voice of Maurice trembled, and he was unable to proceed. Ronald broke the somewhat embarrassing silence by saying, "In short, you have come to the conclusion that my mother is right in her faith, and whatever we actually need for our spiritual advancement is invariably sent, if we but will preserve ourselves in a state of reception. All that you still lack will be supplied in the same way, if you can but believe." "I do believe," answered Maurice, in a tone of greater solemnity than the occasion seemed to demand. But there was a world of meaning in those 3 words. We should be obliged to employ many if we attempted to express a tithe of what he had recently learned to believe through the instrumentality of a noble thinker. A week later, Ronald folded his mother to his throbbing heart and tenderly bade her adieu, but without feeling that he should be parted from her by their material separation. Strange to say, his farewell to his father and Maurice was shadowed by a nearer approach to sadness and more definite sense of sundering. Possibly their spirits had less power than his mother's to annihilate space and follow him whithersoever he went. Maurice was induced to linger a few days longer as the guest of his new friends, and his presence prevented the void left by the departure of a beloved and only son from being too keenly felt. At the commencement of a new week, the young Vicomte removed to Charleston. That city was only a few miles distant from the residence of Ronald's parents. Mr. Walton had made his visitor acquainted with an eminent lawyer who consented to receive Maurice de Gramont as a student. Count Tristan at first violently opposed his son's step, but he could not, with any show of reason, forbid his son studying law as a pastime. The Count's affairs became more and more entangled, and he grew more desirous than ever that his son should contract a wealthy marriage. The hope that Maurice might woo and win one of those numerous heiresses who, Frenchmen imagine, abound in southern El Dorado alone reconciled the haughty nobleman to his son's sojourn in America. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of Fairy Fingers by Cora Mowatt Ritchie. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kelly Taylor. Chapter 19. Aristocrats in America. While Maurice was applying himself to study with a zeal and sense of enjoyment wholly new to him, Bertha was passing through various stages of ennui and testing the patience, or rather digestive powers, of that sorely discomfited bon vivant, her uncle. Day after day she grew more capricious, unreasonable, unmanageable. The distressed Marquis came to the conclusion that his disturbed animal economy could only be restored by amicable separation from his niece. But in vain he bestowed his smiles, his dinners, upon the multitudinous suitors by whom the young heiress was besieged. Her autocratic decree condemned him to the cruel duty of closing the sumptuous repast by the dessert of a dismissal to each lover in turn, without extending the faintest hope that his sentence might be reversed. Finally, the Marquis became a confirmed dyspeptic. The joy of his life was quenched when his appetite failed beyond the resuscitating influence of absinthe and other fashionable stimulants. The glory of his festive board had departed, and he was haunted by the conviction that the unnatural conduct of his niece would bring his whitening hairs through sorrow and indigestion to the grave. A small but dearly prized respite from his trials was granted him when Bertha paid her yearly visit of 4 months to her relatives in Brittany. Her stay, however, was never extended beyond the wonted period, for she found her sojourn at the Chateau de Gramont unmitigatingly dull. The reception of letters from Maurice addressed to his father alone relieved the tediousness of the hours, but these welcome messengers were infrequent, brief, and somewhat cold. They left Bertha so unsatisfied that before the close of the first year of her cousin's absence she opened a correspondence with him herself. The initiative letter was suggested by pleasant things, which she hastened to send. It was written immediately after the 18th anniversary of her birthday, and communicated the agreeable intelligence that upon that day she had again received a token of remembrance from their beloved Madelaine. A yearly gift, bearing the impress of those fairy fingers, was the only sign Madelaine had given that she lived and remembered. 3 years passed on, and upon each birthday, whenever Bertha chanced to be in Bordeaux, in Paris, in Brittany, a small parcel was mysteriously left with the concierge of the house where she was residing. The package was always addressed in Madelaine's handwriting, and contained some exquisite piece of needlework, but no letter, and it bore no mark of post or express. It was invariably delivered by private hand. At least it rendered certain the consolatory facts not only Bertha was unforgotten, but that Madelaine was cognizant of all her movements. No sooner had the heiress reached her majority than she prepared to carry into execution a plan which for a long period had been silently forming itself in her mind. Her earnest desire to visit America had been secretly but systematically strengthened by Count Tristan. He well knew that Marquis de Merivale would never be induced to become her escort, and, what was more likely than that, she should seek the countenance and protection of her other relatives. He played his cards so adroitly that Bertha, without once suspecting his machinations, wrote to him on the very day that closed her 21st year, and invited the countess and himself to accompany her upon an American tour. She took care delicately to make a stipulation that the expenses of the projected trip should devolve upon her. The Count concealed his exultation under an air of well-acted reluctance, and required much persuasion before he could be taught to look with favor upon this unexpected and sudden proposition. There was no simulation in the dismay, the horror, with which Bertha's proposal was greeted by the Countess. How was she to breathe in a land where hereditary claims to rank were unknown, where distinctions of brains, not blood, were alone recognized, where a man might rise to the highest position as ruler of the realm, though his father chanced to be a mechanic, and his grandfather's existence was untraceable? For a time, Bertha's entreaties and the Count's representations were equally impotent. The Countess was inexorable, but her son was not to be baffled. He found an avenue through which her heart could be reached, and her resolution undermined. It lay in the suggestion that Bertha's strong inclination to visit America sprang from a desire again to behold Maurice, and that the result of their meeting after so long a separation might be in the highest degree felicitous. Bertha, he urged, during the absence of Maurice, had probably learned that he was dearer to her than she imagined, and if Maurice had reason to believe that she crossed the ocean for the sake of rejoining him, could he remain insensible to such proof of devotion? The Countess bowed her haughty head to a sacrifice which vitally compromised her dignity. One of the objects of the Count's visits to America was to learn something further of the railroad company with which he was connected. For a time its operations had been suspended, owing to a financial crisis, a sort of periodical American epidemic that, like cholera, sweeps over the land at intervals, making frightful ravage for a season, and departing as mysteriously as it came. The elastic nation, never long prostrate, had risen out of temporary difficulties and depression with a sudden bound, and prosperity walked in the very footprints of the late destroyer. Mr. Hilson had lately announced to Count Tristan that the Railway Association was again in full activity, and that the mooted question of the direction which the road ought to take would, ere long, be decided. He added that, according to his judgment, the left road was indubitably more desirable. Should that road be chosen, it would pass through the property owned by the Vicomte de Gramont. We have already alluded to the immense difference in value of the estate which the advent of the railroad would ensure. Bertha had no difficulty in obtaining the Marquis de Merveille's approval of the contemplated trip. Early in the spring, the party embarked upon one of those superb steamers that sweep across the ocean like floating cities, pulsating with multitudinous life. The passage was so smooth that Bertha thoroughly enjoyed the strange new existence, and found the ever-varying beauty in the gorgeous sunsets, the resplendent moonlight, that she even forsook her berth to see Aurora draw aside her crimson curtain of the dawn. In short, she was in an appreciating mood throughout the voyage, and her happy state allowed her to ignore all the désagréments of the sea. The Countess also, as she sat upon the deck in a comfortable armchair, which she occupied as though it were a throne, and received the homage of the fellow passengers, who were obviously struck and awed by her majestic deportment, pronounced the transit more endurable than she anticipated. Maurice had gone to New York to welcome the voyagers, and when the steamer neared the land he was the first person who bounded upon the deck. Bertha caught sight of him, and as she sprang forward and threw herself into his arms, weeping with joy and hardly returning his warm embrace, the Countess and her son exchanged looks of exultation, which showed that they had not reflected upon the vast distinction between the frank greeting of brother and sister and the meeting of possible lovers. A slight, irrepressible shadow passed over the beaming countenance of Maurice as he turned from Bertha to welcome his father and grandmother. The cloud flitted by in an instant and only betrayed that the past was unforgotten, while the look of manly confidence and self-possession by which it was replaced told that the present and the future could not be subject to bygone storms. After the first salutations were over, the Countess scanned Maurice from head to foot to note what changes had been wrought by his residence in a country which she held in such supreme contempt. The slight curl and quivering of the lip which accompanied her survey bespoke that it was not entirely satisfactory. In the first place, his apparel displeased her. The care that he had once bestowed upon his toilette betrayed a slight leaning to the side of foppishness. Now his attire gave him the air of a man of business rather than of mere pleasure. His bearing was more confident than in his former days, his movements more rapid, his tone more animated and decisive, his whole manner more energetic. His face was slightly careworn, his brow had lost something of its unruffled smoothness. The fresh carnation tints had faded out of his complexion, but the wealth of expression his countenance had gained might atone for the heavier losses. In repose his features wore a shade of habitual sadness, but that disappeared the moment he spoke, and was rather an air of reflection than sorrow. Indeed, all gloom had vanished from his spirit soon after his arrival in America. The hope-inspiring ministry of Ronald's mother, first an engrossing study, and ceaseless occupation next, had effectually medicined his growing melancholy. Maurice had not felt himself a homeless exile during his 4 years' sojourn in a foreign land. The Chateau de Gramont was less dear to him than the quiet, unpretentious, but affection-brightened home where he was always welcomed as a son. When his stately grandmother, after so long a separation, once more appeared before him, the cold dignity, repelling hardness, and self-venerating pride of her demeanor struck him all the more painfully because it conjured up, in contrast, a vision of soft humility, the gentle strength, the intellectual power, the refined tenderness of the lovely woman who realized his ideal of maternity. It almost seemed as though the countess had some internal perception that Maurice weighed her in the balance of new judgment and found her wanting, for she shrank beneath his gaze and turned from him with a sense of sickening disappointment. Bertha, while she was struck by the marked alteration in Maurice, noted the change with undisguised admiration. To her eyes, he was 1,000 times more attractive than ever, and she told him so without a shadow of bashful hesitation. The young French demoiselle had made up her mind to be charmed with America, and little is required to satisfy those who are determined to be pleased. How much of her enthusiasm was legitimately excited, and how much was the spontaneous kindling of her own bright spirit, we will not attempt to describe. Be it enough to say that she frequently declared her most sanguine expectations were far surpassed. The countess, on the other hand, looked through a distorted medium which filled her with disgust. She was horrified at the publicity of hotel life in New York. She could not tolerate the careless ease of the persons with whom she was thrown into accidental communication, the confidence with which the very servants ventured to accost her, the absence of awe, the lack of head and knee bending in her august presence, appeared a tacit insult. She was puzzled to reconcile the freedom with which she was constantly addressed with the greatest deference paid to her sex, while her rank was almost ignored. The mere fact of being a woman commanded an amount of consideration unsurpassed by the veneration paid to titled womanhood in her own land. Nothing, however, shocked her more than the liberty accorded to young American maidens. She found it impossible to comprehend that, educated as responsible beings, the strict surveillance over girlhood's most trivial actions, which is deemed indispensable in France, ceased to be a matter of necessity in America. Immediately upon his arrival in New York, the Count had placed himself in communication with Mr. Hilson, and a few days later received a letter informing him that at a recent meeting of the managers of the Railway Association, a committee of 9 had chosen to decide upon the most suitable direction of the new road. The committee was to give its decision at the end of a fortnight. Mr. Hilson regretted to add that he feared the majority were in favor of the road to the right. He concluded by suggesting that it might be well for the Count to visit Washington and exert over members of the committee any influence that he could command to secure a majority of votes in favor of the road which would prove so advantageous to his son's property. The Count resolved to act at once upon Mr. Hilson's suggestion. When he proposed to his mother and Bertha that they should start the very next day for Washington, the Countess, for the first time since her arrival, expressed herself gratified. At the seat of government she should meet the French ambassador and his wife, the Marquis and Marchioness de Fleury, and possibly in the circle in which they moved she might encounter foreigners with whom it would not be repugnant to associate. Bertha heard Count Tristan's announcement with such bright gleamings of the eyes, such happy flushings of the cheeks, that the sudden radiance which overspread her countenance set Maurice wondering over the emotions that caused her to so warmly welcome this unanticipated change of locality. The reverie into which he had fallen was broken by his father. The Count launched into a discussion upon the management of property in America, then glided into the subject of the Maryland estate, and finally suggested that it would be advisable for his son to grant him a power of attorney which would place him in a situation to act as his representative in any case of emergency. Maurice unhesitatingly expressed his willingness to comply with this request, and the legal instrument was drawn up without delay. Upon receiving the document, the Count assured his son that there was no probability that the power would be required, and voluntarily pledged himself not to make use of it without apprising Maurice. Count Tristan's words and intentions were wholly at variance. His affairs in Brittany had become so frightfully entangled that it was absolutely necessary for him to be able to command a considerable sum to redeem his credit, and he saw no means by which this desirable end could be obtained except by a mortgage upon his son's estate. One of his strongest motives in visiting America was to effect this purpose, but he earnestly desired to conceal from Maurice the step he projected, trusting to his own skill in underhand management for smoothing away of difficulties before there was a necessity for explanation. Maurice accompanied the Count, his mother, and Bertha to Washington, and there, bidding them adieu, and returned to Charleston. His preparatory studies being now completed, he was received as junior partner by the gentleman who had initiated him into the mysteries of his profession. It chanced that Mr. Lolliard had large possessions in certain iron mines in Pennsylvania, which gave promise of yielding an immense profit. He conceived a high esteem for the young Vicomte, and, with a view of promoting his interest, represented him to the advantage of purchasing a few shares, which could at the moment be favorably secured. Maurice had no funds at his command, but Mr. Lolliard suggested that the Vicomte could easily procure the $10,000 needed by a mortgage upon his Maryland estate, and even offered to give him a letter to Mr. Emerson, a personal friend residing in Washington, who, as the estate was wholly unembarrassed, would willingly loan the money upon this security. It was hardly possible for Maurice to have resided so long in America without being slightly bitten by the national mania for speculation, and he gladly accepted the offer of his principal and retraced his steps to Washington. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of Fairy Fingers by Anna Cora Mowatt Ritchie. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kelly Taylor. Chapter 20. The Incognita. Maurice arrived in Washington without having apprised his father of his purposed visit. Count Tristan received him with ill-concealed embarrassment, but the young Vicomte was too ingenious himself, and therefore too unsuspicious of others, for him to attribute his father's discomposure to any source but surprise at his unexpected appearance. If Maurice noted an absence of pleasure in the Count's constrained greeting, he was too much accustomed to the formal and undemonstrative manners of the aristocracy to dwell upon the lack of warmth. The Count had taken up his residence at Brown's Hotel. He chanced to be sitting alone when his son was ushered into the drawing-room. The opportunity was a favorable one for Maurice to communicate to his father the object of his visit. After the first salutations were over, he inquired, rather abruptly, "Have you seen Mr. Hilson? What does he say in regard to the probabilities that the railroad will take the direction which we so much desire?" "Our prospects are tolerably good," returned the Count, "but we need to exert ourselves, and, possibly, you may be of service. The committee that has the decision in its hands consists of 9 persons. Out of these, 4 have declared their preference for the road to the right, and are immovable. Our friends Meredith and Hilson, who are on the committee, vote, of course, for the left road. Then there are 2 rival bankers, Mr. Gobert and Mr. Gilmer, who are bitterly opposed to each other, and generally vote in opposition one to the other. We must bring some agency into play which will induce them, for once, to vote alike." "That seems indispensable, but is it possible?" questioned Maurice. "I trust so. Mr. Gobert, banker of the Marquis de Fleury, who exerts unbounded power over him. One word from the Marquis, and Gobert's vote is secured. The Marquis, as everyone is aware, can always be approached through Madame de Fleury. Obtain her promise that we shall have Mr. Gobert's vote, and it is ours. The Marchioness, I fear, may not have forgiven Bertha's rejection of her brother's suit, but, as both parties are still unmarried and unengaged, if she can only be convinced that Bertha's refusal was a mere girlish caprice, and that there is still hope of the young Duke's success, she will be ready enough to serve us." "But is there hope?" inquired Maurice, quite innocently. The wily schemer replied by a glance half angry, half contemptuous, but without making any other answer, went on. "The other banker, Mr. Gilmer, I am seeking the means to influence. I have no doubt that I shall find them. The 9th member of the committee is Mr. Rutledge, quite a young man, the only son and heir of a Washington millionaire. I learn from Monsieur de Bois that Mr. Rutledge is deeply enamored of the sister of Lord Linden." "I beg pardon, but you have not yet told me who Lord Linden is, and it is so unusual to hear lords mentioned in this country that my ears are quite attuned to the sound of a title." Another hasty look from the Count might have been interpreted into one of slight disgust. His son was far more Americanized than he could have desired. He went on with increased haughtiness. "The English ambassador to the United States married the sister of Lord Linden, and his lordship and a younger sister accompanied them to Washington. Mr. Rutledge expires to the hand of this young lady. So says Monsieur de Bois, who is intimately acquainted with her brother. If she can be interested in our plans, the vote of Mr. Rutledge is easily secured." Maurice could not help laughing. "It is, in reality, the votes of women, then, that are to determine the direction of the road?" "I ought hardly to be surprised at that, for, if they have feeble voices in other lands, they have very decided ones in America. But how is the young lady in question to be reached?" "That is what I am pondering upon," resumed his father. "I shall form some plan, you may be sure, and no time must be wasted in carrying it into execution. I have already ventured to touch upon the subject to Lord Linden, but have not said anything definite. It is a difficult affair to conduct delicately, yet the obtaining of these votes is of such vital importance that we must strain every nerve to secure them." "Certainly, since it will more than treble the value of the property," observed Maurice placidly. "By the by, I presume you have no occasion to use the power of attorney which I gave you. Just at this moment it is very fortunate for me that the estate is wholly unencumbered." The Count grew ashy pale, but Maurice did not observe his change of color, nor mark the hesitating tone in which he replied, "Very fortunate, of course, very fortunate indeed." And then, looking at his watch, he added, "It is time for your grandmother and Bertha to return. Lord Linden and Monsieur de Bois escorted them to the capital. You must be impatient to see them." "In regard to this property, Mr. Lorillard informs me," resumed Maurice, but the Count interrupted him. "A visit to Madame de Fleury is now the first step to be taken. There you may be useful. You are such a dedicated favourite of hers that your advocacy may be inestimable. Suppose you call at once, and learn at what hour she will receive your grandmother, Bertha, and myself. A visit from you will open the way." "I will call with pleasure," answered Maurice. "I have a letter from Monsieur Lorillard to his friend Mr. Emerson, which I would like to deliver without delay. It is a matter of business. Mr. Lorillard thinks that as my estate is wholly unencumbered—" "Oh, we may talk of that at another time," replied the Count hurriedly. "Suppose you pay your visit to the Marchioness at once. It is hardly worth while waiting for the ladies. No one can tell when they may return." Maurice, though he could not interpret the Count's singular manner, could not even remotely divine the meaning of its abruptness and confusion, felt himself checked in his proposed communication. He experienced no uneasiness. He had not the faintest conception that the Count was dealing doubly with him, and that his very first act, on reaching Washington, had been to mortgage the estate of his son for so large an amount that, but for the advent of the railroad, upon which he confidently calculated, the mortgage must prove ruinous to the interest of the landholder. Had Maurice been aware of this fact, he would not for a moment have contemplated delivering to Mr. Emerson Mr. Lorillard's letter, in which it distinctly stated that the property of the Vicomte was without lien. Further discussion between the father and son was prevented by the entrance of the Countess, accompanied by Lord Linden, and followed by Bertha and Gaston de Bois. Maurice, as he saluted his grandmother, was gratified to observe that, albeit her air was by no means less stately, it was more satisfied and complacent. Though titled nobility had no native existence in the semi-civilized land, she rejoiced to find that it was sometimes imported. She had at last encountered an individual with whom she could associate without derogation. The French, as all the world knows, have a national antipathy towards the English, but a nobleman, even though he chanced to be an Englishman, was hailed by the Countess de Gramont upon American soil as a godsend. Lord Linden was not aware of the compliment implied by the unwonted graciousness of her demeanour, and the tone of almost equality in which she addressed him. Maurice comprehended the altered expression that softened his grandmother's countenance, but was struck and amazed by the wonderful radiance of Bertha's face. Her eyes shone as though a veritable sun lived behind those azure heavens, and almost annihilated their colour by its brightness. Her lips were eloquent with a voiceless happiness they did not care to hide, yet could not speak. The laughing dimples played perpetually about her softly suffused cheeks. Her elastic feet almost danced, so airy was their tread. About her whole presence there was a buoyant glow that seemed to encompass her with an atmosphere of light and warmth. She had not attempted to disguise her joy on again meeting Gaston de Bois, and though he paid them repeated visits during their sojourn in Washington, there was always the same deepening of hue upon Bertha's cheek, the same flood of sunshine brightening over her face, the same softening of tones of her voice, the same quickened rise and fall of her fair bosom when he approached. And did he not notice these betraying indications of his own power? Did they strike no electric thrill through his rejoicing soul? If they did, he was too much bewildered by a happiness so unexpected to search out calmly the hidden meaning of these precious signs. The change in deportment and character of M. de Bois, which we described at its commencement, was now fully confirmed. And though the blood still sprang too rapidly into his face, and his breathing grew labored with emotion, and his manner, especially in Bertha's presence, was slightly confused, it was now the confusion of elation rather than embarrassment. The self-control he had acquired had almost overcome his propensity to stammer, and Bertha was unreasonable enough to half regret that she could no longer finish his sentences, and thus prove how instinctively she divined his thoughts. Maurice greeted her, as was his cousinly wont after a separation, with a kiss on either cheek, but for the first time she shrank from his touch, and her ingenuous eyes involuntarily glanced at Gaston, then were quickly cast down, and the multitudinous ringlets that had, as usual, escaped from bondage were a welcome veil as they fell over her face. "Why, my little Bertha, has an absence of 4 years made you forget that we are cousins?" asked Maurice, in surprise at her manner. "No, no," she answered, shaking back the curls and looking up brightly in his face. "I am rejoicing that you have come to Washington. It is a delightful place. I am charmed with everything I see." Did Bertha reflect how much the charm of a locality depends upon our own internal condition? Was she aware that any place, however tame and dull, becomes delightful through the presence of one who creates in us a state of receptive enjoyment? Maurice expressed his intention of calling upon Madame de Fleury. Lord Linden and M. de Bois proposed to accompany him. The 3 gentlemen took their departure together, but soon after they left the hotel, Maurice changed his mind, and, telling his companions that he had some business to transact which required immediate attention, apologized for leaving them, adding that he would call upon Madame de Fleury an hour later, and hoped that he might have the pleasure of meeting them there. M. de Bois proposed to Lord Linden that they also should postpone their visit. "As you please," answered his lordship languidly. "I am perfectly at leisure. I will go wherever you are going. It does not matter where. I am indifferent to place." Lord Linden always was at leisure, and always indifferent, and not unfrequently attached himself to Gaston de Bois, and seemed disposed to accompany him wherever he went. His lordship was one of the vast race of blasé young noblemen, whose opportunities of enjoyment had never been circumscribed, except by the absence of a capacity to enjoy, and who, as a natural sequence, were continually oppressed with a sense of satiety, enervated by the noonday sunshine of unbroken prosperity, and thoroughly weary of their own existence. When his brother-in-law had been appointed ambassador to America, he had accompanied him to the United States with a vague idea that he would be thrown in contact with warlike tribes of Indians, the aborigines of the soil, whose novel and barbarous usages might afford him some mediocre measure of excitement. We need hardly picture his disappointment. The ambassadors from foreign courts and their suites were, as a matter of course, thrown into constant communication with each other, and the secretary of the French ambassador and the brother-in-law of the English formed an acquaintance which ripened into an approach to intimacy. There was no particular affinity between them, but Lord Lyndon liked Monsieur de Bois' company because he was a patient listener, and Lord Lyndon was the opposite to taciturn, and Gaston, though he sometimes, as in the present instance, felt his lordship an encumbrance, had too often been a victim to ennui to not sympathize with his fellow-sufferer. "Mademoiselle de Merivale has a remarkably attractive face," said Lord Lyndon. "I do not particularly fancy blondes. There is too much milk and water and crushed rose leaves in their general make-up, but if a blonde could, to my eyes, enter the charm circle of the positively beautiful, I would give her admission." Gaston, who had fallen into a pleasant reverie, was quickly roused by this observation, and exclaimed with indignant intonation, "Not admit a blonde into a circle of the beautiful? Can anything be lovelier than the countenance you have just looked upon?" "Yes," replied the nobleman, musing his turn. "I think I could show you a face that would make Mademoiselle de Merivale's sink into the most utter insignificance." "Is your beauty a Washington belle?" inquired Gaston, half scornfully. "I do not know. I do not know anything about her. I merely spoke figuratively when I said I could show you, for I certainly could not at this moment. But I allude to the most peerless being that ever captivated the eyes of man. In her, indeed, one could realize the poet's thought, all beauty compassed in a female form." "And who is this incomparable divinity?" asked Gaston, still with a touch of sarcasm in his voice. "Who is she? That is more than I know myself. We were thrown together by an accident, quite an everyday occurrence in this headlong, rushing, pell-mell, neck-breaking land, where the people contemplate railroad catastrophes and steamboat explosion with as cool indifference as though they were a necessary part of a traveller's programme." "You were thrown in contact with your beauty, then, by a railroad collision, or thrown together through the bursting of a broiler?" remarked Gaston interrogatively, and more because civility seemed to demand the question than because he took any especial interest in the narrative. "Yes, quite a stirring incident. I felt alive for a month after. I was traveling from New York to Washington in such a listless and used-up state that in my desperation I seriously pondered upon the amount of emotion that could be derived from jumping off the train at the risk of one's neck. As I was glancing restlessly around, suddenly a face rose before me that riveted my eyes. It was a countenance unlike any I had ever seen. Though features and outline were faultless, in these the least part of its beauty was embodied. There was an eloquence in the rapid transitions of expression that melted one into another. There was a dreamy thoughtfulness in those magnificent hazel eyes. They were not exactly hazel either. They reminded one of topaz. I hardly know what name to give to their hue, but it is useless to attempt to describe such a face and a form. I might heap epitaph upon epitaph, and then leave you without the faintest conception of the bewildering loveliness of their possessor." "You succeeded in becoming acquainted with the lady?" inquired Gaston, now really interested. That good fortune was brought about by one of those ill winds which, for the proverb's sake, must blow good to someone. It could not have been accomplished by any effort of my own, for there was an air of quiet dignity about the lady that no gentleman could have ventured to ruffle by too marked observation, far less by presuming to address even a passing remark. We were about halfway between Philadelphia and Baltimore, when suddenly a terrific shock was felt, followed by a dashing of all humanity to one side of the cars, and a great crash. We had run into another train, and were thrown off the track, and in a moment more upset. "Since you were longing for excitement," observed Gaston, "this agreeable little variety must have gratified you." "Yes, it was well enough in its way, not being positively fatal to existence. You must conceive the confusion and the difficulty of getting upon one's feet. How the people scrambled out of the cars I do not exactly know. For a short time I was too much stunned to see anything distinctly. I remember nothing clearly until somebody helped me up, and in trying to move my left arm I discovered that it was broken." "How unfortunate! And you lost sight of the lady?" "It would have been unfortunate if I had lost sight of her, but I did not. The passengers were huddled together in a most primitive inn by the roadside. There I beheld her, moving about quite unharmed, quieting a child here, assisting a young mother there, doing something helpful everywhere. There chanced to be a surgeon in the cars, who, happily, was uninjured. He saw my predicament, for I was suffering confoundedly, and, upon examining my arm, said that it must be set at once. He called upon several persons to aid him. Some were too much occupied with their own distress, some too bewildered, and some shrank from the task. But, to my supreme joy, it was worth breaking an arm for such a piece of good luck. The lady I just mentioned came forward and offered her services. She tore my handkerchief and her own into bandages, produced a needle and thread from her little travelling reticule, and sewed them together. She assisted the surgeon in the most skilful but calmest manner. What could I do but express my gratitude? This was the opening to a conversation. We were detained several hours at the inn before the train arrived to take us on our journey. I had always detested these American cars, where all the travellers sit together in pairs, but now I rejoiced over them, for I had managed to obtain a seat beside her. We conversed without pause during the whole way to Washington, and what propriety and good sense she evinced! Her beauty had deeply impressed me, but her conversation struck me even more. Such elevated thoughts dropped spontaneously from her lips, and so naturally, that she did not seem to be aware that there was anything peculiar about them. It was enough to drive a man distracted. I confess that it did me." "She came to Washington, then?" "Yes, and here we were forced to part. I begged that she would allow me the privilege of calling to thank her. In the most suave, ladylike, but resolute manner, a manner that silenced all pleading, she declined. But she had inadvertently admitted that she resided in Washington. That has kept me here ever since. I have been searching for her these 6 months." "And you have never met her again?" "No, I have sought her in the higher circles, for from her distinguished and even aristocratic air, her exceeding cultivation and good breeding, I infer that she is a person of standing. It was somewhat singular that a lady of her unmistakable stamp should have been travelling alone, but that is not unusual in this country. In spite of all my efforts, I have never been able to encounter her again. I examined the strips of the fine cambric handkerchief with which my arm was bound, hoping to find a name. Upon one strip the letter M was daintily embroidered. I have those strips yet carefully preserved. Do you think she was an American lady? No, assuredly not. Though she spoke the English language very purely, and as only a scholar could have conversed, a slight accent betrayed that she was a foreigner, French or Italian, I imagine. If only I could behold her once again, I should not be so miserably tired of everything and so bored by my own existence. Washington is killingly dull. By the way, the de Fleuries give a grand ball this Monday. I hear that there is great anxiety prevalent in the beau monde on the score of invitations. Of course, Mademoiselle de Merivale will be there. Her face must create a sensation. What a good piece of fortune it would be if I could see it at this very ball contrasted with that of my lovely incognita. There is a daydream for you. I never attend a ball or a large assembly without a vague anticipation of finding her in the crowd. I should like to hear your candid opinion if you saw those two faces placed side by side. The response which Gaston made to this remark, and which expressed certain convictions of his own, was not uttered aloud. It is one of love's happy prerogatives that the countenance best beloved gains to the lover's eye a charm beyond that with which any other face is endowed, even when he is forced to admit that dearest visage is surpassed in point of positive, calculable, tangible beauty. A man may love a woman perfectly, and yet by no means ignorantly maintain 1,000 women have not larger eyes, enough that she alone has looked at him with eyes that, large or small, have won his soul. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of Fairy Fingers by Cora Mowatt Ritchie. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kelly Taylor. Chapter 21. The Cytherea of Fashion. Maurice had so unceremoniously parted from Lord Linden and Monsieur de Bois because he suddenly remembered that Mr. Lorillard had impressed upon him the necessity of making his arrangements with Mr. Emerson without delay, as the present was a peculiarly favourable moment for purchasing shares in the mine whose iron he hoped to convert to gold. The Vicomte presented himself at Mr. Emerson's office, and delivered Mr. Lorillard's letter. This latter gentleman was held in such high esteem that an introduction of his was certain of meeting with the utmost consideration. Mr. Emerson, after only a brief conversation with Maurice, informed him that he was ready to make the desired loan upon the security offered, and begged that he would call the next morning, when the necessary formalities would at once be gone through. Gratified by his visit and elated by the prospect of effecting a business transaction of so much importance, never dreaming of the fatal sequence which might be the result, Maurice drove to the residence of the French ambassador. It was not Madame de Fleury's reception day, but by some mistake he was ushered into her drawing-room. In a few moments, Lorline, a confidential femme de chambre, whom Maurice had often seen in Paris, being all of fluttering ribbons and alluring smiles and graceful courtesy and coquettish airs, made her appearance. "Madame has received the card of Monsieur le Vicomte," she began, with a sugary accent and soft manner, which reminded one strongly of the tones and deportment of her mistress. "Madame would not treat Monsieur as a stranger, and therefore sent me," here with her head on one side she curtsied again bewitchingly, "to say that we have a new valet, an ignorant fellow, for it is impossible to procure a decent domestic in America, and this untrained creature has to be drilled into les usages, and he has forgotten that Madame only receives on Saturday. Madame, however, would see Monsieur le Vicomte at any time that was possible." "I am delighted to hear you say so," returned Maurice, "for I am very desirous of having the pleasure of paying my respects."
"Madame is preparing for a matinée at the Spanish Embassy. She is just coiffée, and Monsieur should see what a magnificent head I have made for her. Notwithstanding my success with her head, she is at this moment in deep distress. Her dress has not yet arrived. We expect it every moment. Madame's agitation is overpowering. She is quite unequal to encountering a disappointment of this crushing nature. She begs Monsieur will excuse."
Before she could finish the sentence, the Marchioness herself appeared, wrapped in a delicate rose-coloured robe de chambre, prodigally adorned with lace and embroidery.
"My dear Monsieur de Gramont, I meant to excuse myself, but I am forced to wait for that tantalizing dress. A few moments with you, en attendant, will divert my thoughts. I had heard from Monsieur de Bois that Countess de Gramont and her son, with Mademoiselle de Merveille, are honoring Washington by their presence, but I was informed that you were not here. You see, I paid you the compliment of inquiring."
As she spoke, she glanced at the mirror opposite and arranged the long sprays of feathery flowers that were mingling with her braided tresses. "I am highly flattered at not being forgotten," replied Maurice. "I only arrived this morning, and hasten to pay my respects."
"And you ought to be very much flattered that I can spare you an instant at such a critical moment. Here is my toilette for this matinée at a dead standstill, because that tiresome dress has not come. It is one I ordered expressly for the occasion, and I assure you it is a perfect triumph of art, a victory gained over obstacles. Let me tell you, nothing is more difficult to manage than an appropriate costume for a matinée. One's toilette must be a delicate compromise between ball attire and full visiting dress, but Mademoiselle Melanie has hit the juste milieu, and succeeded in carrying me through all the perils of Scylla and Charybdis. Oh dear, stamping her tiny slippered foot. Will that dress never come?
"It must be very trying," said Maurice, endeavouring to assume a tone of sympathy.
"Trying! It is killing my state of mind. I cannot go without this dress. All my other toilettes have been seen more than once in public, and this one was sure to create a sensation, was planned for this very occasion."
"I fear my visit is inopportune and ought to be shortened," replied Maurice, for the agitated manner and troubled look of Madame de Fleury made him feel that he must be an intruder. "I will only remain long enough to know if you will receive my grandmother, my father, and my cousin, Mademoiselle Bertha, tomorrow. They are very—"
"Hush!"
cried Madame de Fleury, raising her finger and listening with an eager countenance.
"Was that a ring? Patrick is opening the door. Hush! Let me listen. It is the dress. It must be the dress."
And she made several rapid steps towards the door, but returned to her seat as the servant passed through the entry with empty hands.
"This is terrible. I have not my wits about me. I do not know what I am doing or saying."
"I am truly concerned," observed Maurice, who had risen to depart. "May I tell the Countess de Gramont that you will receive her tomorrow?"
"Tomorrow? Yes, certainly. I do not remember an engagement, but I can think of nothing at the moment. If that tormenting dress would only arrive. I fear will never be here. It is the first time Mademoiselle Melanie ever disappointed me. She is punctuality itself. This waiting is torture. It completely upsets me, turns my brain. It will throw me into a nervous fever. You insensible men cannot feel for such a position. You do not know the importance of a toilette.
We must be very dull if we do not know how to appreciate those of Madame de Fleury, replied Maurice, bowing courteously. Pray do not include me in the catalogue of such sightless individuals. I will bid you adieu until tomorrow, when you will allow me to accompany my grandmother.
You are always welcome. Pray tell the countess I shall be charmed to see her, and say the same to that cruel Mademoiselle Bertha, though I ought not to forgive her treatment of my brother. Say to her that he is yet unconsoled. Good gracious, that dress is certainly not coming. If it were to arrive at this moment, I should be obliged to hasten, and to give the finishing touches to a toilette in a hurried and discomposed manner is to run the risk of spoiling the general effect. What can have happened to Mademoiselle Melanie? Hark! Is not that someone? Did you not hear a ring? I am not mistaken. Someone did come in. Is it the dress at last? The Marchioness started up joyfully, with clasped hands, and an expression of deep gratitude. A servant entered with a note. She snatched it petulantly, and tossed it into the card-basket unopened. How vexatious! Only a note! It is too cruel. I shall never, never pardon Mademoiselle Melanie if she disappoints me. But that's easy enough to say, difficult enough to carry into execution. In reality, I could not exist without her, and Mademoiselle Melanie knows that as well as I do. She is so sought after that her exhibition rooms are crowded from morning until night. It is now a favour for her to receive any new customers, and I believe she has some 30 or 40 workwomen in her employment. Of course, you have heard of Mademoiselle Melanie. I have not had that pleasure. She is a mantua-maker, I presume, returned Maurice, repressing a smile. I suppose that is what, strictly speaking, we must call her, but she is the very queen of taste, the sovereign of modiste. She has a genius that is extraordinary. It is magic. It is inspiration. A touch of her hand transformed everyone who approaches her. What figures she has made for some of these American women! What charms she has developed in them! What an air and grace she has imparted to their whole appearance! She makes the most vulgar look elegant, the elegant divine. Another ring! Now, heaven grant it may be the dress at last! The Marchioness was again disappointed. It was only another note, which shared the fate of the former. "Oh, I shall not survive this!" she ejaculated, dropping into an armchair. "And that horrid little Mrs. Gilmer will triumph in my absence. You know Mrs. Gilmer?" "I have not had that honour," returned Maurice, who, impatient as he was to take his leave, found it impossible to depart while the Marchioness chose to detain him. "She attempts to pass herself off for a belle, and even tries to take precedence of me, ignoring all the customs of good society. But doubtless the poor thing is actually ignorant of them, and should be pardoned and pitied for her ill-breeding. She is the wife of Gilmer, the rich banker. It is to Mademoiselle Melanie that she is indebted for all her social success. Mademoiselle Melanie positively created her, and she never wears anything made by anyone else. It is all owing to Mademoiselle Melanie that the men surround her as they do, and try to persuade themselves that she is pretty. pretty, with her turned-up nose and her colourless hair and eyes. Her husband is immensely rich, and as wealth rules the day in this country, she takes good care that the depth of his purse shall be known. For that purpose she loads herself with diamonds, always diamonds. She has not the least idea of varying her jewels. Even Mademoiselle Melanie cannot make her comprehend that art. I wonder she does not have a dress contrived of bank notes. That would be novel, and it would also prove a capital way of announcing her opulence.
A rather dangerous costume, returned Maurice, laughing.
At all events, it would be original, and as originality is sure to produce an effect, a saucy little par nouveau might afford to follow my advice, even though it came from an enemy.
Maurice could not help exclaiming with a comical intonation, for there was something irresistibly ludicrous in the punny fierceness of the dressed doll. An enemy!
"Oh, there is no concealment about it," exclaimed Madame de Fleury, with an air of Lilliputian belligerent. "It is open warfare. We are at swords' points, and all the world knows our animosity, and Mrs. Gilmer has the impertinence to pretend that our styles are quite similar, and that the same modes become us. She even declares that such has been Mademoiselle Melanie's verdict, and from the judgment of Mademoiselle Melanie nobody dares to appeal."
"This Mademoiselle Melanie is Parisian, I presume?" asked Maurice, more because it seemed polite to say something than from any interest in the answer to his question.
"Could she be anything else?" replied Madame de Fleury with enthusiasm. "Could a being gifted with such wondrous taste have been born out of Paris? She is a protégée of Vignon's, and when I was exiled, Mademoiselle Melanie came to America with me. She instantly became known. There is a Mr. Hilson here, to whom she probably brought letters, for he has taken up the deepest interest in trumpeting her fame. She has created a perfect furore."
"Hilson?" repeated Maurice musingly. "A gentleman of that name visited Brittany before I left. I wonder if it can be the same person."
"Very likely, for he has been abroad. I have heard him mentioned in Brittany. Well, this Hilson was so infatuated with— Hush! There is the ring!"
While Madame de Fleury listened in breathless expectation, Lurline opened the door and announced,
"The dress of Madame has arrived. At last, what happiness! I am saved, when I had almost given up all hope. Monsieur de Gramont, you will excuse me. Au revoir."
Before Maurice could utter his congratulations upon the advent of the dress, she glided out of the room. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Fairy Fingers by Cora Mowatt Ritchie. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kelly Taylor. Chapter 22. Meeting. The tangled web Count Tristan had woven for others began to fold its meshes around himself, and to torture him with the dread that he might be caught in his own snare. From the moment Maurice arrived in Washington, an event the Count had not anticipated, his covert use of the authority entrusted to him was menaced with discovery. To a frank, straightforward character, the very natural alternative would have suggested itself of explaining, and, as far as possible, justifying the step taken. But to a mind so full of guile, so wedded to wily schemes as the Count's, a simple, upright course would never have occurred. The fear of exposure threw him into a state of nervous irritability which allowed no rest, and he was compelled to pay the price of deception by plunging deeper into her labyrinths, though every step rendered extrication from the briery mazes more difficult. On the morrow, Maurice accompanied his grandmother, Bertha, and Count Tristan to the residence of Marchioness de Fleury. Count Tristan's malaise evidenced itself by his unusually fretful and preoccupied manner, his querulous tone, and partial forgetfulness of those polite observances of which he was rarely oblivious. He allowed his mother to stand, looking at him in blind amazement, before he remembered to open the door, was very near passing out of the room before her, and scarcely recollected to hand her into the carriage. His abstraction was partially dissipated by her scornful comment upon the contagious influences of a plebeian country, but to recover himself entirely was out of the question. On reaching the ambassador's mansion, the visitors were disconcerted by the information that Madame de Fleury did not receive. "She will receive us," answered Maurice, recovering himself. "We are here by appointment." And, passing the surprised domestic, he ushered his grandmother into the drawing-room. Bertha and Count Tristan followed. The servant, with evident hesitation, took the cards that were handed to him and retired. The door of the salon chanced to remain open, and rendered audible a whispered conversation going on in the entry. "I dare not disturb Madame at this moment. She would fly into a terrible rage. You know she never allows her toilette to be disturbed." These words, spoken in a female voice, reached the ears of the visitors. "But the gentleman says it is an appointment. What's to be done? What am I to answer?" was the rejoinder in a rough male tone. "You are a blockhead. You have no management," replied the first voice. "I will arrange the matter without your stupidness." Lurline now courtesied herself into the room, and, after bestowing an arch glance of recognition upon the Vicomte, addressed the Countess. "I am désolée to be obliged to inform Madame that Madame de Fleury is at this moment so much absorbed by her toilette that I fear I shall have no opportunity of making known the honor of the Madame's visit. My mistress has made an engagement to go to the capital to hear some distinguished orator. It is Madame's debut in the spring attire this season. Madame's dress, bonnet, and mantle have at this moment been sent home. A more delicately fresh toilette de printemps cannot be conceived. It will establish the fact that spring has arrived. But Madame has not yet essayed her attire and assured herself of its effect. I trust Madame la Comtesse will deem this sufficient apology for not being received." As she concluded, Lurline simpered and curtsied, and seemed confident that she had gracefully acquitted herself of a difficult duty. "Not receive us when we are here by invitation!" ejaculated the Countess angrily. "Is Madame de Fleury aware that it is the Countess de Gramont and her family who are calling upon her?" "There must be some mistake," interposed Maurice. Then, turning to the femme de chambre, he added, "I beg that you deliver these cards to the Marchioness and bring me an answer." "How am I to refuse, monsieur?" replied Lurline, hesitating, yet softening her unwillingness to comply by a volley of sidelong glances. "Monsieur is not aware that he is placing me in a most delicate position. It is against Madame's rules to be disturbed when her toilette is progressing. It requires her concentrated attention, her whole mind. Still, if monsieur insists, I will run the risk of Madame's displeasure. Monsieur must only be kind enough to wait, and allow me to watch for a favourable moment when I can place these cards before Madame." With a low salutation and a coquettish movement of the head that set all her ribbons fluttering, the femme de chambre made her exit. "Not receive us? Make us wait?" exclaimed the countess wrathfully. "Truly, Madame de Fleury has profited by her sojourn among savages. This is not to be endured. Let us depart at once." "My dear mother," began Count Tristan soothingly, "it will not do to be offended or to notice the slight, if there be one, but I am sure none is intended. It is absolutely indispensable that I should see the Countess and get her to present this letter to Marquis de Fleury, and also that I should obtain his promise that she will influence him to secure the vote of Mr. Gobert. Pray be courteous to the Marchioness when she makes her appearance, or all is lost." "What degradation will you demand of me next? How can you suppose it possible that I can be courteous? I tell you I am furious." "But you do not know all that depends upon obtaining these votes. Think of this railroad, of the vital importance of the direction it takes. Think of the Maryland property, which is almost all that is left to us." "Have I not again and again begged you not to meddle with railroads, not to occupy yourself with business matters which a nobleman is bound to ignore?" "And obeying you as far as I could, and only acting in secret, I have nearly ruined myself," answered the Count with growing excitement. At this moment the loud ringing of a bell was heard, accompanied by the voice of Lurline, speaking in tones of great tribulation.
Patrick, do you not hear the bell? Come here quickly. What's to be done? Such a calamity. It's dreadful. It's dreadful."
Count Tristan started up and went to the door to question the femme de chambre, fearing that the calamity in question might be of a nature sufficiently serious to prevent the much-desired interview. Lurline was standing in the hall. She wore her hat and shawl, and was giving directions to a domestic in the most rapid and flurried manner. "Will Madame de Fleury receive us?" inquired the Count anxiously.
"I told Monsieur that I could not promise him, and now that this misfortune has befallen us, it is thoroughly impossible even to make your presence here known to Madame. Who could have anticipated such a contretemps? Never before has Mademoiselle Melanie allowed a dress to issue from her hands which did not fit à merveille, and there are 2 important alterations to be made in this before it can be worn. Madame is in despair. She will go out of her senses. It will give her a brain fever."
"Can we not have the pleasure of seeing her for a few moments, when her toilette is completed?" inquired Maurice.
"Ah, there it is. When her toilette is completed. Will it be completed in time for her to reach the Senate at the hour proposed? Monsieur will pardon me, but I have not a moment to spare."
Turning to Patrick, she added,
"I am forced to go out to purchase some ribbons. I have left Madame in the hands of Antoinette. Madame is in such a state that one might weep to see her. Take care not to admit anyone, except Countess Orlowski, who accompanies your mistress to the Senate. I will be back presently."
The Countess de Gramont rose up majestically. "Let us depart, my son. Never more will I cross this threshold, never enter this house where I have been insulted." "No insult was intended," replied Count Tristan nervously. "Even if it were, we are not in a position to be cognizant of insults. We should be forced to ignore them. I cannot leave without entreating the Marchioness to deliver this letter to Monsieur de Fleury herself. It must be done, and today. There is not an instant to lose." And you can stoop so low, you can demean yourself to such a degree. What a humiliation! Humiliations are not to be taken into consideration where ruin stares us in the face, he answered violently. Is this so very important? Inquired Bertha, struck by the Count's angry manner. Of more importance than I can explain to you.
Oh, then let us stay, aunt. We must make allowances for Madame de Fleury's ruling passion, her toilette first, all the world afterwards.
A carriage just then drove to the door and attracted the attention of Bertha, who was standing by the open window.
What magnificent horses, and what a neat equipage! All the appointments in such admirable taste. A lady is descending. I suppose it must be the Countess Orlowski. What a dignified air she has! What a graceful bearing! I wish I could see her face. She must be handsome, with such a perfect figure. Yes, I am right. It is the Countess Orlowski, for as the servant has admitted her.
As the lady was passing through the hall, she said to the domestic, No need to announce me. I will go at once to the chamber of Madame de Fleury. At the sound of that voice, the shriek of joy that broke from Bertha's lips drowned the amazed exclamation from Maurice. In another instant, Bertha's arms were around the stranger, and her kisses were mingled with tears and broken ejaculations as she embraced her rapturously. Maurice stood beside them, struggling with emotion that caused his manly frame to vibrate head to foot, while his dilated eyes appeared spellbound by some familiar apparition which they hardly dared to believe was palpable. There is such a joy which, in its wild excess, paralyzes the faculties, makes dumb the voice, confuses the brain, until ecstasy becomes agony, and all the senses are enveloped in a cloud of doubt. Such was the joy of Maurice as he stood powerless, questioning the blissful reality of the hour, yet in the actual presence of that being who was never a moment absent from his mental vision.
Madelaine, Madelaine, my own Madelaine! Have we found you at last? Is it really you? Sobbed Bertha, whose tears always flowed easily, but now poured in torrents from their blue heavens.
And Madelaine, as she passionately returned her cousin's embrace, dropped her head upon Bertha's shoulder and also wept. Madelaine! At that tremulously tender voice, her face was lifted and turned towards Maurice, turned for the first time for nearly 5 long years, and yet, at that moment, he felt as though it had never been turned away. Bertha involuntarily loosened her arms, and Madelaine extended her hand to Maurice. He clasped it fervently, but his quivering lips gave forth no sound. One irrepressible look of perfect joy from Madelaine's luminous eyes had answered the impassioned gaze of his. One smile of ineffable gratitude played over her sweet lips. For an instant the eyes were raised heavenward in mute thanksgiving, and then sought the ground, as though they feared to reveal too much. And the smile of transport changed to one of grave serenity, and the wonted quietude of her demeanor returned. The Countess and Count Tristan had both risen in speechless surprise, but had made no attempt to approach Madelaine, whom Bertha now drew into the room.
Madelaine, I cannot believe that I am not dreaming, cried the latter. I cannot believe that I have found you, that is really you, and that you are lovelier than ever. You no longer look pale and careworn. You are happy, my own Madelaine. You are happy, are you not? But why have you forgotten us?
I have never forgotten, never forgotten, faltered Madelaine, in a voice that had the sound of tears, answering to those that glittered in her eyes. Maurice had not released her hand, and, bending over her, made an effort to speak, but at that moment the stern voice of the countess broke in harshly. "How is it that we find you here, Mademoiselle de Gramont? Where have you hidden yourself? What have you done since you fled from my protection?" "Yes, what have you done?" chimed in Count Tristan. "How is it that we find you descending in a handsome equipage and elegantly attired?"
"I have done nothing for which I shall ever have to blush," answered Madelaine, with a dignity that awed him into silence.
"It was needless to say that, dear Madelaine," cried Maurice, whose powers of utterance had returned when he saw Madelaine was about to be assailed. "No one who knows you would dare to believe that you ever committed an action that demanded a blush." Madelaine thanked him with her speaking countenance. Perhaps it was only fancy, but he thought he felt a light, grateful pressure of the hand he held.
"But tell us where you have been," continued Bertha affectionately. "You look differently, Madelaine, and yet the same. And how this rich attire becomes you. You are no longer poor and dependent, then, are you?"
"I am no longer poor and no longer dependent," answered Madelaine in a tone of honest pride. "Is it possible?" exclaimed the Count and his mother together.
"But how has all this happened?" Bertha ran on. "Oh, I can divine. You are married. You have made a brilliant marriage."
At those words a suppressed groan of unutterable anguish struck on Madelaine's ear. The hand Maurice held dropped from his grasp.
"Speak, do speak, dear Madelaine," continued Bertha. "Tell us all your sufferings, for you must have suffered at first, and all your joys, since you are happy now. And tell us how you chanced to be here in America, as we are, and how it happened that you are calling upon the Marchioness de Fleury at the same time as ourselves, and why you expect to be received by her, though she will not receive us."
Before Madelaine could reply, and she was evidently collecting herself to speak, Lurline, who had just returned from executing her commission, passed through the hall. The door of the drawing-room stood open. She caught sight of Madelaine and ran toward her, exclaiming joyfully,
"Oh, what good fortune! How rejoiced my poor mistress will be! She did not dare to hope for this great kindness. I am so thankful. I will fly to announce to her the good news."
She hurried away, leaving Madelaine's relatives more than ever amazed by these mysterious words. Count Tristan was the first to break the silence. Ever keenly alive to his own interest, he saw a great advantage to be gained if he had interpreted the language of the femme de chambre rightly. In an altered tone, a tone of marked consideration, he asked, "You are well acquainted with the Marchioness de Fleury?" "Very well," replied Madelaine, with an incomprehensible emphasis, while a smile that had a faint touch of satire flitted over her face. "She receives you?" questioned the Count. "Always," answered Madelaine, smiling again. "She esteems you?" persisted the Count.
"I have every reason to believe that she does." "And you have influence with her?" joined in Bertha, suspecting the Count's drift and feeling desirous of aiding him. "I think I may venture to say I have." "Oh, how fortunate!" cried Bertha. "You may be of the greatest service to our cousin Count Tristan." She took the letter out of his hand, and placing it in Madelaine's, added, "Beg Madame de Fleury to read this letter, and obtain her promise that she will use her influence with the Marquis de Fleury to cause Mr. Gobert, that's his name, is it not?" appealing to the Count, "to cause Mr. Gobert to vote as herein instructed. See how well I have explained the matter. I really believe I have an underdeveloped talent for business."
"The letter should reach Madame de Fleury this morning. The appeal should be made to the Marquis today, this very day," urged the Count. "It shall be," replied Madelaine, with quiet confidence. The countess interposed. "What, my son, you are willing to solicit the interference of Mademoiselle de Gramont without knowing how and where she has passed her time? How she has lived since she fled from the Chateau de Gramont? I refuse my consent to such a proceeding." "Aunt, madame," returned Madelaine in a gently pleading voice, "do not deprive me of the pleasure of serving you. Humble and unworthy instrument that I am, leave me that happiness." "If the Marchioness would only grant me a few moments' interview this morning," said Count Tristan, who evidently doubted the strength of Madelaine's advocacy. "I promise that she will grant you an interview this morning," replied Madelaine, interrupting him. The femme de chambre now re-entered and said, "Madame is impatient at this delay. Every moment seems an hour." "Say that I will be with her immediately," answered Madelaine. She then addressed the Count. "Have no fears. You may depend upon me. The Countess will receive you the moment her toilette is completed." Madelaine once more embraced Bertha, once more extended her hand to Maurice, who stood bewildered, dismayed, looking half petrified, and passed out of the room. As soon as she had disappeared, Bertha broke forth joyously. "Well, aunt, what do you think now of our Madelaine? Is not this magic? Is not this a fairy-like denouement? She disappears from the Chateau de Gramont as though the earth had opened to swallow her. No trace of her could be discovered for nearly 5 years, and suddenly she rises up in our very midst, a grand lady, enveloped in a cloud of mystery, and working as many wonders as a veritable witch. She leaves us poor, friendless, dependent, and returns to us rich, powerful, and with influential friends, ready to serve those who once protected her. But I think I found the key to the enigma. Did we not hear strict orders given that none but Countess Orlowski should be admitted? Well, Madelaine was at once allowed to enter. It follows beyond doubt that she is Countess Orlowski." This version of Madelaine's position seemed to strike both the Countess and her son not as merely possibly but probably correct. "I always thought," returned the Count, "that Madelaine was a young person who, in the end—" His mother finished the sentence in a tone of pride, "would prove herself worthy of the family to which she belongs." The loud ringing of the street doorbell attracted the attention of the group assembled in the drawing-room. A well-known voice exchanged a few words with the servant, and Gaston de Bois entered. His manner was unusually perturbed, and he looked around the room as though in search of someone. The instant he appeared, Bertha exclaimed, "Oh, Monsieur de Bois, Monsieur de Bois! We are all so much rejoiced. Madelaine, our own Madelaine, is found at last. She is here in this very house, at this very moment." I knew it," answered Monsieur de Bois, with a mixture of embarrassment and exultation. "You knew it? How could you have known it?" asked Maurice eagerly. "I saw her carriage at the door." "Her carriage? She has a carriage of her own, then?" inquired the Count. "Yes, and the most superb horses in Washington." "You knew, then, that she was here?" cried Maurice with emotion. "You knew it, and you never told us?" "I knew it, but I was forbidden to tell you. I hoped you would meet. I felt sure you would. I did not know how or when, but from the moment you put your foot in the city, I looked for this meeting. I was strongly impelled to bring it about, but my promise withheld me." "Of course you would not break a promise. That explanation is quite satisfactory," remarked Bertha. "I am sure you would have given us a hint but for your promise." I almost gave one in spite of it. I found it harder to keep silent than I used to find it to speak, and that was difficult enough. But have the goodness to unravel us with this great mystery, demanded the Count. Madelaine is married to Count Orlowski, the Russian ambassador. A nobleman of position, added the Countess. How did this come about? Inquired the Count. Monsieur de Bois looked stupefied. Who said she was married? He gasped out. Why do you imagine that she is married? She is not married, then? Say that she is not, broke in Maurice, hanging upon the reply as though it were a sentence of life or death. No, not married at all. Not in the least married. Maurice did not answer, but the sound that issued from his lips almost resembled the sob of hysteric passion. Tell us quickly all about her, besought Bertha impatiently. Yes, speak, said the Countess imperiously. Speak, echoed the Count. Gaston, my dear friend, pray speak quickly, Maurice besought. I wish I could. That's just what I want to do. But it's not easy. You bewilder me with so much questions. But the time has come when you must know that she has the honor to be. Go on, urged Maurice. I wish I could. It's not so easy to explain. Plain. The rustling of a silk dress made him turn. The Marchioness du Fleury, in the most captivating spring attire, stood before them. Here is Madame du Fleury, and she can tell you herself much better than I can, said Monsieur de Bois, apparently much relieved. The Marchioness saluted her guest with excessive cordiality, softly murmured her gratification at their visit, and added apologetically, I must entreat your pardon for allowing you to wait. It was not in my power to be more punctual. A terrible accident, the first of the kind which ever occurred to me, is my excuse. Do not imagine, my dear Vicomte, turning to Maurice with a fascinating smile, that I had forgotten my appointment, but at the Russian embassy yesterday I was prevailed upon to promise that I would be present at the Senate today to hear the speech of a Vermont orator, a sort of Orson Demosthenes, who has gained a great renown by his rude but stirring eloquence. We ladies have been promised admission, which is now and then granted, to the floor of the house, instead of being crammed into the close galleries. It will be a brilliant occasion. I invited the Countess Orlowski to accompany me. If all had gone well, I should have been ready to receive your visit before she came. The brow of the Countess smoothed a little as she answered, I felt confident, madame, that there must have been some explanation. I fear you are displeased with me, resumed Madame de Fleury playfully, but I will earn my pardon. You will be compelled to forgive me. Monsieur de Fleury meets me at the capital, and I will deliver this letter of the Count into his hand, and make him promise blindfold to consent to any request that it may contain. Madame, returned the Count, bowing to the ground, I shall never be able to express my gratitude. You can hardly form a conception of the favour you are conferring upon me. That letter is of the highest importance, and my indebtedness beggars all expression. To be frank with you, Count, answered Madame de Fleury, you owe me nothing. You are only indebted to the advocate you chose, one whom I never refuse.
one to whom I feel under the deepest obligation, especially this morning, one who is so modest that she can seldom be induced to ask me a favor, or to allow me to serve her. Thus, you see, it is but natural that I should seize with avidity upon this opportunity."
The Count looked at his mother triumphantly, and as the face of the Marchioness was turned towards Bertha, he whispered, "Shall I not tell her that Madelaine is our niece?" The Countess seemed disposed to consent, for the words of Madame de Fleury had gratified as much as they astonished her. The Marchioness addressed Countess de Gramont again.
"I trust, madame, that you will allow me to waive ceremony and take a liberty with you, since it is in the hope of being some service. I should like to reach the capital before the oration commences, and if this letter must be delivered to Monsieur de Fleury immediately, my going early will enable me to have a few moments' conversation with him, which I probably shall not get after the orator rises. Will you excuse me if I tear myself away? And will you give me the pleasure of your company tomorrow evening? Tomorrow is my reception day, and some of my friends honor me in the evening. I am désolée at this apparent want of courtesy, but I am sure you see the necessity."
The Countess bowed her permission to Madame de Fleury's departure, and the Count overwhelmed her with thanks. The Countess would herself have taken leave, but anxiety to learn something further of Madelaine caused her to linger. The Marchioness now addressed her valet, who was standing in the hall awaiting orders.
"Patrick, when Madame Orlowski calls, beg her to pardon my preceding her to the capital. Say that I will reserve a seat by my side."
"Then the lady who just visited you was not Madame Orlowski?" inquired the Count, more puzzled than ever.
"No, indeed. She is worth 1,000 Madame Orlowskis."
The Count's glance at his mother seemed again to ask her permission to allow him to announce that Madelaine was their relative. "We felt certain that she was one of the magnates," began the Count. The Marchioness interrupted him.
"She is better than that. She has all the magnates of the land, that is, the female magnates, at her feet. The foreign ladies swear by her, rave about her, and as for the Americans, they are demented, and would gladly pave her path with gold, that being their way of expressing appreciation. Madame Meneska passes whole mornings with her. Madame Poniatowski talks to no one else. She enchants everyone, offends no one. For myself, I have only one fault to find with her. I owe her only one grudge. If it had not been for her aid, that impertinent little Mrs. Gilmer would not have such success in society. If I could succeed in making her close her doors against Mrs. Gilmer, what a satisfaction it would be! Then, and only then, should I be content."
The Count could restrain himself no longer. "We are highly gratified to hear this, madame. It concerns us more nearly than you are aware. The lady is not wholly a stranger to us. In fact, she
Indeed, she was so little known in Paris that you were fortunate in finding her out. I appreciated her there, but I did not know how much actual credit was due her, for she had not risen to her present distinction. I confess she is the one person in America without whom I could not possibly exist."
"Is this possible?" exclaimed the Countess.
"And I cannot be grateful enough to her," continued the Marchioness, "for her visit this morning, for she never goes out, or so seldom that I dare not to expect, to even hope for her presence, yet her conscientiousness made her come. She suspected I was in difficulty, and hastened here."
"It is like her, she was always charming, so thoughtful for others," observed the Count, as complacently as though this were an opinion he was in the habit of expressing for years.
"You may well say she is charming," responded Madame de Fleury. "And what knowledge she possesses of all the requirements, the most subtle refinements of good society! What polished manners she has! What choice language she uses! What poetical expression she gives to all her sentiments! I often forget myself when I am talking her, and fancy that I am communicating with a person of the same standing as myself, and without knowing what I am doing, I involuntarily treat her as an equal."
"An equal, of course, most certainly," answered the Countess, aghast. The amazement of the Count, Maurice, and Bertha sealed their lips.
"Her taste, her talent, her invention is something almost supernatural," continued the Marchioness enthusiastically,
for now that she was launched upon her favorite theme, she had forgotten her haste.
"She sees at a glance all the good points of a figure. She knows how to bring them out strongly. She discovers by intuition what is lacking, and dexterously hides the defects. I have seen her convert the veriest dowdy into an elegant woman, and when she gets a subject that pleases her, she perfectly revels in her art. Look at this dress, for instance. See by what delicate combinations it announces the spring."
The Marchioness was struck with the consternation depicted in the countenances of her visitors. Bertha was the only one who could command sufficient voice to falter out, "That dress, then?"
"It was her invention," replied the Marchioness triumphantly. "Anyone would recognize it in a moment as coming from the hands of Mademoiselle Melanie. Though she has such a wonderful creative fertility, her style is unmistakable. There was never a mantua maker like her." "A mantua maker! A mantua maker!" exclaimed the Countess and her son at once, in accents of disgust and indignation. "Ah, I see that you do not like to apply that epithet to her, and you are right. She should not be designated as a mantua maker, but a great artist, a true artist, a fairy, who with one touch of her wand can metamorphose and beautify and amaze." At that moment a servant announced that the Countess Orlowski awaited in her carriage and desired him to say that she feared she was late. "You will excuse me, then," murmured the Marchioness. "I must hasten to execute my mission for Mademoiselle Melanie, since it was she who so warmly solicited me to undertake this delicate little transaction, and I would not disappoint her for the world. Pray do not forget tomorrow evening. Au revoir." She floated out of the room, leaving the Countess and her son speechless with rage and indignation. Bertha and Maurice stood looking at each other, and then at Monsieur de Bois, the only one who expressed no surprise, but seemed rather more gratified than moved when he beheld the Countess sink back in her chair and apply the bottle of sal volatile to her nose. The shock to her pride had been so terrible that she appeared to be in danger of fainting. End of chapter 22.
Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and click on the bell to turn on notifications.